My wife filed for divorce on a Wednesday night in the second week of August, standing in our kitchen with her car keys still in her hand, and she said it the way you'd announce a change in weekend plans, calm, rehearsed, almost gentle, as if she'd practiced the sentence in her car in the driveway before coming inside. She said, "Mark, I think we both know this marriage has run its course, and I've asked myself for a long time if I was going to be honest with you, and I've decided I have to be. I want a divorce." She stood there waiting for my face to fall apart, waiting for shock, for begging, for the particular kind of wounded confusion she had clearly built her entire evening around managing. What she did not know, what she could not have known, because I had spent 5 months making absolutely sure she would never know until the exact moment I chose to tell her, was that 2 days earlier, on the Tuesday, I had already instructed my own attorney to file the paperwork. What she did not know was that I had spent the better part of a year quietly assembling a folder of financial records, a private investigator's full report, 22 months of credit card statements, and a legal strategy built by a woman named Patricia Nolan, who does not lose custody fights. What she did not know, standing in my kitchen with her keys still in her hand and her rehearsed sentence hanging in the air between us, was that I had known about Trevor Holt for 5 months, and that I had already stopped being her husband in every way that mattered, a long time before she found the courage to stand in that kitchen and pretend she was the one leaving me. My name is Mark Dawson. I'm 42 years old, and until the week I'm about to tell you about, I would have described my life as quiet in the best possible sense of that word. Not boring, not stagnant, just quiet. The kind of quiet you build on purpose after you've decided what actually matters to you. I'm a senior financial manager at Harlow Freight Logistics, a regional trucking and distribution company headquartered here in Maple Ridge, Ohio. A job I've held for 11 years and one I'm good at. Not because I'm brilliant, but because I am patient, and I notice things, and I do not act until I understand the full shape of a problem. That last part turned out to matter more than I ever expected it to. I want to tell you this story in order from the beginning, because I think the order is the only way it actually makes sense, and because I've noticed that when people hear the short version, the version where a man finds out his wife is cheating, and calmly lawyers up before she even knows he knows, they assume I'm cold or vindictive, or that I enjoyed some part of it. I didn't enjoy any part of it. I want you to understand by the time I'm done telling you this, that what I did was not revenge. It was arithmetic. It was simply refusing to let someone else control the timeline of the worst thing that ever happened to my family. Claire and I got married 14 years ago, in a small ceremony at her parents' church here in Maple Ridge, followed by a reception in the community hall that her mother decorated herself with mason jars and string lights, because we didn't have the budget for anything fancier, and I remember standing at the altar thinking that I had never in my life felt so certain about anything as I felt about marrying her. Claire Bennett, before she became Claire Dawson, was sharp in a way that made everyone else in a room feel slightly slower, funny in a dry, understated way that took people a while to catch on to, and ambitious in a way I found genuinely attractive rather than intimidating, which I think surprised both of us at the time, because the men she had dated before me had apparently found her ambition to be some kind of character flaw they needed to manage. I never felt that way. I liked that she wanted things. I liked watching her build a career out of nothing, starting as a junior agent at a real estate office downtown, learning the business from the ground up, staying late to study contract law on her own time, because nobody was going to hand her anything. We built a life the ordinary way, the way most people do, one unremarkable year stacked on top of another. We bought a house on Kestrel Lane in the Amherst Hills neighbourhood, a modest 4-bedroom with a yard that took me 3 summers to actually get the grass to grow right in the shaded corner by the fence. Our son Nathan was born 2 years into the marriage, and our daughter Sophie came 4 years after that. And somewhere in the space between those 2 births and the years since, we became the kind of family that has a rhythm to it. School drop-offs and soccer practices and Sunday dinners at Claire's parents' house, and the specific comfortable boredom of a marriage that has stopped needing to prove anything to anybody. I want to be honest about something before I go any further, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. I was not a perfect husband. I don't say that to soften what's coming, or to imply some kind of moral equivalence between what I did wrong and what Claire eventually did, because there is no equivalence, and I want to be very clear about that. But I worked long hours. I brought stress home from Harlow more often than I should have, particularly during the 2 fiscal years when the company was restructuring its Midwest distribution routes, and I was effectively doing the job of 2 people. I was, if I'm honest, not always fully present at the dinner table, sometimes still half in a spreadsheet in my head while Sophie told me about her day. Claire mentioned this to me more than once, not as an accusation, just as an observation, the way you'd point out a habit to someone you loved and hoped would notice on their own eventually. I heard her. I told myself I heard her. I'm not sure, looking back, that I actually changed much in response, and I think that gap between hearing your wife and actually adjusting your life around what she needs is where a lot of marriages start to hollow out quietly, long before anyone says the word divorce out loud. I don't think that gap excuses what came next. I think it's simply true, and I want to tell this story with all the true things in it, including the ones that don't make me look good. Claire had been working at Ridgeline Realty Group, the largest independent real estate brokerage in Maple Ridge, for 9 years by the time everything I'm about to describe happened. She'd started there in our 5th year of marriage, a career change from the insurance office job she'd hated, and I remember how alive she looked in those first years, coming home with stories about difficult closings and impossible clients, and the particular satisfaction of handing a young couple the keys to their first house. Ridgeline was founded decades ago by a man named Gordon Ridgeline, who by the time this story takes place was 78 years old and mostly retired from day-to-day operations, still technically the owner, but content to let the brokerage run itself under the people he trusted. One of those people was Trevor Holt. Trevor became a partner at Ridgeline in our 6th year of marriage, which put him working directly alongside Claire for 8 years by the time all of this came apart. I'd met him at a handful of company holiday parties and one memorable 4th of July barbecue at Gordon Ridgeline's lake house, and my honest impression of him, for years, was that he was pleasant enough in the shallow way that a lot of successful real estate people are pleasant. Good at small talk, good at remembering names, divorced himself, no kids. The kind of man who always seemed to be between projects, renovating a boat or training for a half marathon or flipping a duplex on the side. I did not think about Trevor Holt very much at all, for most of those 8 years, which I want to be honest is exactly what he and Claire were counting on, though I didn't understand that yet. I want to walk you through how this actually started to unravel, because I think the specific texture of discovering something like this matters. The slowness of it, the way your brain fights the evidence for months before it accepts what it's looking at. It didn't begin with some dramatic discovery. It began in January of this year with something so small I almost didn't notice it at all, which was that Claire started going to a 6 a.m. spin class 3 mornings a week at a gym across town, a 25-minute drive from our house, when there were 2 gyms within 10 minutes of Kestrel Lane. I remember asking her about it, not suspiciously, just conversationally, over coffee one morning, why that particular gym, and she said the instructor was better, the class times worked better, with her showing schedule, a handful of perfectly reasonable explanations that I accepted without a second thought, because why would I not accept them? 14 years of marriage builds a particular kind of trust, the kind that doesn't interrogate small inconsistencies, because interrogating small inconsistencies in a marriage you believe is solid feels almost insulting to the person you're married to. I want you to understand that about me going into this. I was not a suspicious husband. I was not the kind of man who checked his wife's phone or tracked her location. I trusted Claire completely, right up until the point where the evidence became impossible to explain away with reasonable-sounding sentences. The spin class was the first thing. The second thing, a few weeks later, was that Claire's phone started living face down on whatever surface was nearest her. A habit I noticed only because it was new, because for 13 years her phone had simply existed in whatever position it landed in. Screen up, screen down, didn't matter. And now there was a small, consistent motion. Phone rings, phone gets flipped, phone gets carried into another room to be answered. I noticed it the way you notice a change in the pitch of a familiar engine. Not alarming exactly, just different. A data point sitting quietly in the back of my mind without yet connecting to anything. The third thing, and this is the one that actually started the machinery turning in my head, happened in March, on an ordinary Tuesday evening when I was doing what I do most weeks, which is sit down with our joint financial statements and reconcile everything against our budget, a habit left over from my job that Claire used to tease me about affectionately, calling me her personal auditor. I want to explain something about our finances here because it matters to what I found. Claire and I had always kept one joint account for household expenses and separate personal accounts for incidental spending, an arrangement that had worked fine for years, except that Claire's real estate commissions occasionally required her to expense certain costs, client dinners, staging supplies. the occasional overnight trip for a regional real estate conference, and those expenses sometimes ran through a business account tied to Ridgeline that I had view-only access to as part of our shared financial planning, mostly so our accountant could track deductions at tax time. I was reconciling that account against our tax software in March, a task I'd done a dozen times before without incident, when I found a charge from a hotel in Columbus, 90 minutes from Maple Ridge, dated on a Thursday 2 weeks earlier, a night Claire had told me she was staying over at a regional conference for continuing education credits. The charge itself wasn't the strange part. Conference hotels are normal. What was strange was the room type. A one-bedroom suite with a listed rate that was roughly 3 times what Ridgeline typically approved for a standard conference stay, and a checkout time of 11 the next morning. An hour after the conference she'd described was supposed to have already started. I sat with that for a long time that night. The way you sit with a splinter, you're not sure is actually there, or if you've just irritated the skin around where you think it might be. I didn't say anything to Claire. I told myself there were a dozen explanations: an upgrade she got for some loyalty program reason, a late start to the conference day, 100 small administrative details I wasn't privy to and had no real right to interrogate. But I want to be honest that something in me had already shifted that night. Some quiet internal gear had turned, and over the following 2 weeks I found myself doing something I had never once done in 14 years of marriage, which was paying close, deliberate attention, not confronting, not accusing, just watching, the way you watch weather building on a horizon before you decide whether to bring in the porch furniture. What I noticed, once I was actually looking, accumulated faster than I expected, and I think that's the part that still unsettles me most when I look back. How much had apparently been happening in plain sight for months, hiding not because it was hidden particularly well, but because I simply hadn't been looking. Claire's work hours extended later on Tuesdays and Thursdays specifically, always with a showing or a closing that ran long, always explained in the same, slightly too detailed way people explain things they have rehearsed. She started dressing differently for those particular days, not dramatically, nothing anyone else would have clocked. But I had watched this woman get dressed for work 6 days a week for 14 years, and I knew the difference between her getting dressed to sell a house and getting dressed for something else. She laughed at her phone more, a small private laugh at a text message, and put the phone away quickly when I walked into the room. Not guiltily exactly, just quickly, the reflexive quickness of someone protecting a conversation rather than hiding a crime, which I understand now is often exactly the same motion. I did not confront her. I want to explain why, because I think this is the part of the story people struggle with the most. The part where they want to know why a man who suspected his wife was having an affair didn't simply sit her down and ask her directly. The honest answer is that I've built an entire career out of not acting on incomplete information. At Harlow, if I go to the executive team with a budget projection based on a hunch and 2 suspicious line items, I get laughed out of the room, and rightly so, because a hunch is not a fact, and acting on a hunch instead of a fact is how good people make catastrophic decisions. I did not want to sit Claire down and ask her if she was having an affair, have her look me in the eye and say absolutely not, Mark. Where is this even coming from? And then spend the next 6 months of my marriage having planted a seed of paranoid suspicion in a relationship that might, for all I actually knew at that point, have been completely innocent. I wanted to know, not suspect, know. And I had decided somewhere in that quiet, unglamorous process of reconciling a hotel bill on a Tuesday night in March, that if I was going to find out my marriage was over, I was going to find out on my own terms, with my own information, before anyone else got to control what happened next. In April, I hired a private investigator. His name was Ray Coleman, a former county sheriff's deputy who'd been running his own investigation firm out of a strip mall office near the highway for about 15 years, a man recommended to me, carefully and quietly, by a colleague at Harlow who had gone through something similar himself 2 years earlier and never talked about it at the office. I remember sitting in Ray's small office, a room that smelled like burnt coffee and had a single dying plant in the corner, and telling him everything I'd noticed, the hotel charge, the spin class, the phone, the Tuesday and Thursday pattern, and Ray listened without much visible reaction, the way I imagine a doctor listens to a list of symptoms he's heard described 1,000 times before in 1,000 different voices, and when I finished he said, "Mr. Dawson, I want to tell you something before we start, because I tell every client this and most of them don't listen. Right now you have suspicion. In about 6 weeks, you're going to have certainty one way or the other. And I need you to understand that certainty is a different animal than suspicion. Suspicion, you can still talk yourself out of on a bad night. Certainty, you can't. Make sure you actually want to know before I go find out. I told him I wanted to know. I have thought about that sentence more times than almost any other sentence I said that whole year, because I meant it completely in April, and I still meant it completely in August, and I think that consistency is the one thing I'm actually proud of in this entire story. I didn't change my mind halfway through because the truth got uncomfortable. I asked for the truth, and I got it, and I dealt with it the way I deal with everything, methodically, one confirmed fact at a time. Ray called me in the first week of May, 5 weeks after I hired him, and asked me to come to his office rather than talk on the phone, which I understood before he said another word to mean that he had found something. I remember the drive there with a specific kind of clarity I don't have for most ordinary days of my life. The exact colour of the sky, a grey, low, early summer overcast, the specific song on the radio that I turned off halfway through because I couldn't concentrate on it, the traffic light on Route 9 that stayed red for what felt like 4 full minutes while I sat there with my hands tight on the wheel, already grieving something I hadn't been told yet. Ray had a manila folder waiting on his desk when I walked in, and he didn't open it right away. He asked me to sit down first, and he said, "Mr. Dawson, before I show you this, I want to remind you what I told you in April. You're about to move from suspicion to certainty, and I can't put the folder back closed once you've seen what's inside it." I told him to open it. The photographs were time-stamped and dated, taken from a legal public vantage point across the street from a hotel in Columbus, the same hotel chain, though a different location than the March charge I'd found. They showed Claire, unmistakably Claire, in a blue dress I recognised because I had complimented her on it 3 weeks earlier without knowing where she planned to wear it, walking into the hotel lobby at 6:47 in the evening on a Thursday, the same Thursday she had told me was a late closing with an out-of-town buyer. 11 minutes later, according to Ray's notes, Trevor Holt walked into the same lobby through a different entrance, a small, practiced detail that told me this was not the first time either of them had done this. The staggered arrival, the different doors, the choreography of 2 people who had learned exactly how not to be seen walking in together. There were photographs of them checking out separately the following morning as well. Trevor first, at 8:15 and Claire 20 minutes later, and a photograph of Claire's car, the same grey sedan she'd driven for 3 years, parked in the hotel's back lot rather than the main entrance lot where a legitimate business guest would have parked. I sat in that small office with the burnt coffee smell and the dying plant in the corner, and looked at photographs of my wife for a long time without saying anything at all, and Ray, to his credit, let me have that silence without filling it with anything. When I finally spoke, what came out of me was not what I expected. I didn't ask if he was sure because the photographs were not ambiguous. I asked him how long he thought it had been going on, and he said, based on patterns he'd cross-referenced against her calendar and the timing of certain transactions, his professional estimate was at least 8 to 10 months, possibly longer, possibly considerably longer, though he was careful, in the way I came to respect about Ray over the following months, never to speculate beyond what he could actually document. I want to tell you honestly what I felt sitting there, because it wasn't the explosive cinematic grief you might expect. It was something quieter and colder, a kind of settling, the specific sensation of a question you've been almost afraid to fully ask, finally getting answered. And underneath the grief already, some small cold part of my brain that has always been good with numbers and contingencies was already starting to ask a completely different question, which was, now that I know this is true, what exactly am I going to do about it, and in what order? I drove home that evening, and I did not confront Claire. I want to be honest that this was, by a significant margin, the hardest part of the entire process, harder than anything that came later, because I sat across the dinner table from my wife that night, watched her help Sophie with a spelling worksheet, watched her laugh at something Nathan said about his math teacher, and the entire time some part of me was screaming to just say it, just put the folder on the table and ask her to explain the blue dress and the staggered hotel entrances, and I did not do it, because I had already decided somewhere between Ray's office and my driveway that confronting her that night, in the heat of that specific fresh wound, would hand her something I was not willing to hand her, which was the ability to control the narrative before I had finished building mine. I want to explain the reasoning behind that decision, because I think it's the part of this story people either understand instantly or never understand at all. I work in finance. I've spent 11 years watching companies make catastrophic decisions because they acted on emotion before they had a complete picture, and I've spent 11 years watching the companies that survive difficult situations do so because someone, somewhere, insisted on gathering every fact before making a single move. I did not want to have an emotional confrontation with Claire that ended in a screaming match, a tearful denial, a temporary reconciliation built on guilt and fear that would fall apart again in 6 months once she felt safe. I wanted the truth fully documented, I wanted my legal position fully secured, and I wanted to control the exact moment and exact terms under which this marriage ended, because I understood, with a clarity that surprised even me, that whoever spoke first in a situation like this was going to spend the next several months on defense, reacting to the other person's version of events instead of standing on solid ground of their own. So I said nothing. I went to work the next day. I picked up dry cleaning. I helped Nathan with a science project about the water cycle. I sat next to Claire on the couch that Friday night while we watched half of a movie neither of us finished before falling asleep, her head against my shoulder in a way that felt, I want to be honest, almost unbearable, because some part of me still loved the woman whose head was on my shoulder, even while another part of me was already, quietly, beginning to build the case that would end our marriage. I don't think people talk enough about how those two things can exist in the same chest at the same time. Love and preparation for war, grief and strategy, and I don't have a tidy explanation for how I held both of those things during those months except to say that I did. Because I had to, because falling apart was a luxury I could not afford until my children's future was secure. 2 weeks after Ray's first report in the middle of May, I made an appointment with an attorney named Patricia Nolan, a family law specialist whose name I'd gotten, again quietly, again through a colleague who vouched for her without asking too many questions about why I needed the referral. Patricia's office was on the 4th floor of a converted bank building downtown, all dark wood and law books that looked actually used rather than decorative, and she was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who listened to my entire story without interrupting once, taking notes in a handwriting so small and precise it looked almost typed. When I finished, she set her pen down and said, "Mr. Dawson, I want to ask you something before we discuss strategy, because I ask every client this and the honest answer changes everything about how we proceed. Do you want to save this marriage, or do you want to end it well?" I told her I didn't know yet, that some part of me still held out a small, probably foolish hope that I was wrong, or that there was some explanation, even though I knew, looking at those photographs, that there wasn't. Patricia nodded like she'd heard that exact answer 100 times before and said, "That's fine. That's actually the right answer for where you are right now. Here's what I want you to understand. Whatever you decide, the work we do over the next several months is identical either way. You gather documentation, you protect your position, you do not tip your hand. If you end up reconciling, none of this preparation hurts you. If you end up divorcing, all of this preparation is the difference between a fair outcome and a fight that drags on for 2 years and costs you both your savings and half your sanity." That sentence reframed something for me, and I've thought about it often since. I had been quietly assuming that hiring an investigator and consulting a divorce attorney meant I'd already decided to end my marriage, and some guilty part of me had been carrying that assumption around like its own kind of infidelity, the idea that I was betraying Claire simply by preparing for the possibility that she had betrayed me. Patricia's framing gave me permission to see it differently. Preparation was not betrayal. Preparation was simply refusing to be blindsided twice, once by the affair itself, and then a second time by a legal process I didn't understand while emotionally underwater. Over the following weeks, Patricia walked me through exactly what I needed to gather, and I began the quiet, methodical work of documenting our entire financial life together. Mortgage statements, retirement account balances, the value of Claire's stake in her real estate commissions and her small ownership interest in Ridgeline's referral program, tax returns going back 7 years, the title on the house, the 2 vehicles, a modest inheritance my mother had left me 4 years earlier that I wanted to make sure remained clearly documented as separate property. None of this required lying to Claire or sneaking around in any dramatic way, because so much of it existed in shared files and joint statements I had every legitimate right to access as her husband. I simply started making copies, quietly, methodically, storing them somewhere she would never think to look, which turned out to be a small storage unit I rented under my own name across town. a $20 a month unit that held nothing but a fireproof lockbox and a stack of folders that represented, by the time I was done, the entire architecture of a life I was preparing to divide fairly, whether or not I ever had to. June brought the second wave of information, and it came from two directions at once: Ray's ongoing surveillance and, unexpectedly, a conversation I had not engineered at all. Ray's second report, delivered in the first week of June, contained what he called pattern confirmation rather than new incidents, 3 additional documented meetings, 2 at the same Columbus hotel and 1 at a rental property Ridgeline had listed, and, according to the county's public records that Ray had cross-referenced, had been sitting vacant and unsold for 4 months, conveniently available for private showings that required no other agent, no other witnesses, no explanation beyond the professional cover of maintaining an empty listing. Ray had also obtained, through entirely legal means involving a subpoena, he helped me understand I did not yet have the standing to issue but which Patricia would be able to request once litigation formally began, a summary of call and text frequency between 2 phone numbers, Claire's and one registered to Trevor Holt, that showed a pattern climbing steadily over the prior year, from a handful of contacts a week that could be explained by ordinary work correspondence between business partners to dozens of contacts a day, many of them late at night, many of them on weekends when no reasonable business explanation existed at all. The unexpected part came from Jenny Ostrander, another agent at Ridgeline who had worked alongside Claire for 6 years and who I'd always liked, a blunt, funny woman who came to our house every Christmas with a bottle of wine and left 3 hours later having made everyone laugh until their sides hurt. I ran into Jenny at the grocery store on a Saturday in mid-June, an entirely accidental encounter, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee, and after the ordinary small talk she paused in a way that told me something was coming and said, "Mark, I probably shouldn't say anything, and I'm going to feel terrible if I'm wrong about this, but I need you to hear it from someone who cares about you rather than from gossip that's already going around the office in pieces." She told me, carefully, that several people at Ridgeline had noticed the pattern with Trevor and Claire for months. The vacant listing showings, the way they left client dinners separately but arrived back at the office within minutes of each other, the way Trevor's assistant had mentioned once, offhandedly, calendar blocks that didn't correspond to any actual client. Jenny said she'd debated for weeks whether to say anything to me at all, worried about being wrong, worried about the damage to a friendship if she was wrong, and had finally decided that if the situation were reversed, she would want someone to tell her, even at the risk of being wrong, rather than let her walk further into something everyone else could already see. I thanked Jenny, standing there in the coffee aisle with my hands strangely steady, and I told her the truth, that I already knew, that I had known for weeks, and watched her face go through a complicated series of emotions, relief that she hadn't been the one to break the news to a man who had no idea, and something like fury on my behalf when she understood I'd been carrying this alone. She asked me what I was going to do, and I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, that I was still gathering everything I needed before I made any decision, and she said something I've thought about often since. She said, "Mark, for what it's worth," and I probably shouldn't say this either, but Trevor's done this before, not at Ridgeline, before Ridgeline, with his first marriage. There's a version of this story his ex-wife could tell you if she ever wanted to, and I think Claire either doesn't know that part or has decided it doesn't apply to her situation. I filed that piece of information away without immediately acting on it, though it would matter more than I expected in the months ahead. By the end of June, I had enough documented evidence, enough financial preparation, and enough legal groundwork that Patricia and I sat down for what she called our strategy session, the meeting where we stopped preparing in the abstract and started building an actual plan for how and when I would move. She laid out the legal reality plainly. Ohio is a no-fault divorce state, which meant Claire's affair, however well documented, would not by itself dramatically change the financial division of marital assets in most circumstances, a fact that initially frustrated me until Patricia explained why the documentation still mattered enormously. It mattered for custody because judges do consider the stability and judgment of each parent, and a pattern of deception combined with exposing the children to an ongoing affair could factor into custody discussions in ways that were subtle but real. It mattered for asset division in cases where marital funds had been used to facilitate the affair, and Patricia was already building a case that some of the Columbus hotel charges, and possibly the vacant listing arrangement, constituted dissipation of marital assets, money spent by one spouse for a purpose entirely unrelated to the marriage, which Ohio courts can and do account for when dividing property. And it mattered, Patricia said, in a way that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the actual experience of going through a divorce. Because a spouse who knows the full truth and has already secured competent representation negotiates from an entirely different position than a spouse who is still emotionally reeling from a fresh betrayal. I want to have you walk into that courthouse, Patricia told me, already knowing everything, already having made your decisions, so that Claire's timeline, whatever she eventually plans to do, has to react to yours instead of the other way around. We spent July finalising what Patricia called the framework, the actual divorce petition, drafted and ready, along with a proposed parenting plan built around keeping Nathan and Sophie in the same school district, the same house if possible, at least through the end of the current school year, and a financial settlement proposal that Patricia described as fair rather than punitive, because she told me plainly, judges and mediators respond better to reasonable people, and because I want you to be able to look your own children in the eye in 10 years and know you handled this like their father should, not like a man trying to win a war. I opened a separate bank account in July as well. Not to hide money, Patricia was clear that any last-minute asset shuffling would look terrible and could actually be used against me, but simply to have an account of my own established and functioning before the legal process began, the kind of ordinary practical step any attorney recommends to a client heading toward a filing. I moved copies of the last several years of our financial documents into the storage unit, alongside Ray's full reports and Patricia's draft filings, everything organised in a way that would let me hand a complete, coherent picture to a judge on the very first day it was needed. I want to pause here and describe what those months actually felt like to live through, because I think the outside version of this story, the version where a calm, methodical man quietly builds an airtight legal case, makes it sound easier than it was. It was not easy. I was living in a house with a woman I still loved, in some complicated, wounded way I couldn't fully turn off, just because I had proof of what she was doing, raising 2 children who had no idea their entire world was standing on a foundation that was already cracked. And I was doing all of this while performing an ordinary domestic life every single evening. Dinner, homework, bedtime stories for Sophie who still wanted them at 8 years old, weekend soccer games for Nathan where Claire and I sat next to each other in folding chairs and cheered together like nothing at all was wrong. There were nights I lay awake next to her, listening to her breathe, running through Patricia's checklist in my head, and there were other nights where some old, stubborn part of me still hoped, against every piece of evidence in that storage unit, that I was somehow building a case against a woman who would never actually need it, that she would end things with Trevor on her own, come to me in tears one night and confess everything, and that we would find some way through it that didn't require a courtroom at all. I want to be honest that this hope did not fully die until the second week of August, and I think that's an important thing to say, because I don't want anyone listening to this to think I moved through those 5 months like some emotionless machine. I moved through them like a man trying to hold 2 completely incompatible truths in his chest at the same time, and it cost me more than I let anyone see, including, for a long time, myself. By the first week of August, Patricia's office had the petition fully drafted, reviewed, and ready to be filed the moment I gave the word. She called it, in her characteristically dry way, a loaded but unfired weapon, sitting in a drawer, changing nothing about our daily lives until I decided otherwise. I remember sitting across from her that first week of August, looking at the final draft of the parenting plan, the asset division proposal, my own signature waiting at the bottom of a page that would end 14 years of marriage the moment it was filed with the county clerk, and Patricia asked me the same question she'd asked in May. "Are you ready to end this well, Mr. Dawson, or do you still need more time?" I told her I needed one more piece. I wanted Ray's absolute final report, the one that closed every possible gap before I gave the order to file, because I did not want to walk into this with 98% certainty when 100% was still available to me. She respected that completely. She told me to call her the moment I had it. That final piece came on a Monday morning in the second week of August, the week that would end with Claire standing in our kitchen with her car keys in her hand. Ray called me at my office at Harlow just after 9, asked if I could come by that afternoon, and I told my assistant I had a doctor's appointment and drove across town with the particular hollow calm I'd come to recognise as the feeling of approaching the end of something. Ray's final report was, in his words, the closer, the piece that would leave absolutely no room for any explanation Claire might ever construct if this ever went to a courtroom. It included a sworn statement from a hotel valet in Columbus, a young man named Dimitri who Ray had interviewed carefully and legally, who confirmed recognizing both Claire and Trevor from photographs, confirmed the frequency of their visits over the prior year, and confirmed, in a detail that landed on me harder than almost anything else in the entire 5 months, that Trevor had, on at least 2 occasions the valet could specifically recall, referred to Claire in casual conversation as, in the valet's own words, basically like she was already his, in front of hotel staff with the easy comfort of a man who considered the relationship settled rather than secret. The report also included a full financial reconciliation Ray had built in partnership with a forensic accountant, tracing 11 months of expenses across both the personal and business accounts, establishing a conservative estimate of at least $14,000 in what Patricia would later formally classify, in the language of Ohio family law, as dissipation of marital assets, money spent to facilitate and sustain the affair, money that had, in a very direct sense, come out of what should have been our children's future. I sat in Ray's office and read the entire report twice, and when I finished, Ray said something I've thought about often since. He said, "Mr. Dawson, I've done this job for 15 years and I want to tell you something most of my clients never get to hear, because most of them fall apart somewhere around week 3, and I end up talking them through it more than actually investigating anything. You did not fall apart. You stayed level the entire time, and I don't say that to compliment you. I say it because it's rare, and because I think it's the reason you're about to walk out of this whole situation in better shape than almost anyone I've ever worked with." I called Patricia from my car in Ray's parking lot before I even left, and I told her, "File it. Tomorrow. I'm ready." Patricia filed the petition for dissolution of marriage with the county clerk's office on Tuesday morning. I want to explain, because I didn't fully understand this myself before Patricia walked me through it, that filing a petition does not mean the other party is notified instantly or dramatically. There is a process, formal service, that takes days, sometimes longer depending on how it's handled, and Patricia and I had discussed at length how I wanted Claire to actually be served. I had decided, and Patricia agreed it was both legally sound and, in her words, remarkably classy, given what she'd have been entitled to make far messier, that I did not want Claire served at her office in front of her colleagues, and I did not want her served in front of our children at home. I asked Patricia to arrange for formal service to be handled quietly, delivered to her directly, timed for later in the week, which gave me, unexpectedly, a strange handful of days where the petition existed, filed, real, irreversible, while Claire still had absolutely no idea it existed at all. I went to work that Tuesday and sat through a budget meeting discussing fourth-quarter freight projections with a version of calm that surprised even me, because somewhere in the county clerk's system, a document existed now that said, formally, legally, in language far more clinical than anything I actually felt, that Mark Dawson was ending his marriage to Claire Dawson. I drove home that evening and Claire was already there, home early for once, and she seemed distracted in a way I might not have noticed 6 months earlier, but noticed instantly now, checking her phone twice during dinner, offering shorter answers than usual to Sophie's questions about a class field trip, and I remember thinking, with a strange clinical detachment, that something was clearly moving on her end of this as well, though I had no way yet of knowing what. I found out on Wednesday, the very next evening, and it came at me sideways, the way the most important moments in your life often do. I got home from Harlow around 6, and Nathan and Sophie were at Claire's parents' house for the evening, a standing arrangement on Wednesdays that had existed for years and that I registered, that particular night, as unusually convenient timing, though I didn't let myself fully follow that thought yet. Claire's car was already in the driveway when I pulled in, which was unusual for a Wednesday, and when I walked into the kitchen she was standing there, still in her work clothes, her car keys still in her hand like she'd walked in only moments before me and hadn't even set them down, and I knew, the instant I saw her face, that whatever was about to happen had been rehearsed, because Claire has a particular stillness she gets when she's steadying herself for something, a stillness I'd seen exactly twice before in 14 years, once before she told her father she was quitting the insurance job, and once before she told me she was pregnant with Sophie. She said my name first, Mark, in a tone that was gentle in a way that felt, even before she said anything else, like the gentleness people use right before they hurt you. The gentleness of someone who has decided kindness in delivery can somehow offset the actual content of what they're about to say. Then she said it. "Mark, I think we both know this marriage has run its course. I've thought about this for a long time, longer than I probably should have without saying anything, and I've decided I owe you the honesty of just saying it plainly instead of letting us both keep pretending. I want a divorce. I want to describe as precisely as I can what happened inside me in the silence right after she said that sentence, because it was not what she was expecting, and I could see, almost instantly, that my reaction was throwing off whatever internal script she'd built for this moment. She'd clearly prepared for shock. She had clearly prepared, based on how her shoulders were braced, for anger, for pleading, maybe for tears, some version of a devastated husband she would then need to manage through the next uncomfortable 10 minutes with careful, rehearsed compassion. What she got instead was silence, and then, after a pause just long enough to make her visibly uncertain, a question, delivered in a voice so level it clearly unsettled her more than any amount of shouting would have. I said, "Okay, can I ask what's actually driving this, Claire? Or is this a decision you've already fully made without wanting to discuss the reasons?" She recovered quickly, I'll give her that. Launching into a version of events I could tell she had rehearsed extensively, probably in her car, probably more than once. She talked about growing apart, about feeling unseen for years, about the long hours I'd worked during the Harlow restructuring 2 years earlier, and how something in her had quietly closed off during that stretch and never fully reopened. She talked about wanting to be honest rather than let us waste more years pretending. And then, carefully, delicately, she said the sentence I'd been waiting 5 months to hear her say out loud, though she delivered it as though it were a brand new confession rather than an 8-year-old fact I already had fully documented in a storage unit across town. She said, "Mark, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. I've developed feelings for someone else. It happened slowly, over a long time, and I didn't go looking for it, and I know that doesn't make it okay. But I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve me protecting myself by not telling you the whole truth." I let her finish completely. I want to be honest that some small human part of me, even after everything, felt a flicker of something like relief, hearing her finally say a true sentence out loud after months of watching her live a lie in front of our children, and I let that flicker exist for exactly as long as it needed to before I set it aside and asked the question I'd been saving for this exact moment. I said, "Is it Trevor?" I watched her face change in a way I will remember for the rest of my life. It wasn't just surprise, it was the specific total collapse of a person watching a script fall apart in real time, watching every carefully rehearsed line become suddenly, retroactively useless, because the entire structure of the conversation she'd planned depended on her being the one revealing information, on me being a full step behind her, discovering the affair for the first time in this exact kitchen, on this exact Wednesday evening while she controlled the pacing, the framing, the sympathy. Her mouth opened and nothing came out for a long moment, and then she said quietly, "How do you know that name?" And I said, "Claire, I've known for 5 months. I want to describe what happened over the next several minutes in that kitchen as precisely as I can, because it is the part of this story people ask me about most, and because I think the sequence of her reactions tells you almost everything you need to know about the difference between the version of events she'd built for herself and the actual truth she was now being forced to confront. The first thing she did was deny it, reflexively, the word no coming out of her before her brain had apparently caught up with the fact that denial was no longer a strategy that could survive contact with a specific number like 5 months. "Mark, I don't know what you think you know, but you're wrong. We're colleagues. Trevor and I work together, that's all this is." And I remember watching her say this while her own hand had come up to her mouth, an old, unconscious gesture I recognised from every other time in our marriage she'd been caught in even a small lie, the body confessing things the mouth hadn't caught up to yet. I did not raise my voice. I want to be honest that some part of me had rehearsed this moment almost as thoroughly as she had apparently rehearsed her divorce announcement. Not the words exactly, but the tone, the specific decision to stay level no matter what she said next. Because I understood, with total clarity, that the moment I raised my voice, the moment I gave her a version of me that looked unhinged or vindictive, she would have something to work with, a story she could tell later about a husband who lost control, a narrative that could shift sympathy in her direction, no matter what the underlying facts were. So I stayed level, and I said, "Claire, I have photographs of you and Trevor entering and leaving a hotel in Columbus on 11 separate occasions over the last 4 months alone, and a documented pattern going back at least 8 to 10 months before that. I have call and text records showing contact between your phone and his, climbing from a handful of calls a week to dozens a day. I have a sworn statement from hotel staff. I have receipts. I've known the exact shape of this for 5 months, and I did not say a single word to you because I wanted to know the entire truth before I said anything at all, and now I do." She sat down at that point, or rather her legs seemed to simply stop holding her up in the particular way they had been, and she lowered herself into a kitchen chair with her keys, finally sat down on the table, and she looked up at me with an expression that moved over the following several minutes through nearly every stage of a person watching their own narrative collapse in real time. First, there was a kind of stunned disorientation, the specific vertigo of someone realizing the person across from them has known something enormous for a very long time while she'd been walking around believing she held all the power in the room. Then, and I want to be honest that this was the part that actually surprised me, because some naive part of me had expected shame to come next. What came next instead was something closer to anger, redirected, remarkably fast. Away from herself and onto me, she said, "You had me investigated. You hired someone to follow me. Mark, that's insane. That's a complete violation of my privacy. How could you do that to me without saying anything?" I let that sit in the room for a moment before I answered, because I think it's important in telling this story to be honest about how strange it felt to be accused of a violation by the person who had spent the better part of a year deceiving me in our own marriage, in the house we owned together, around the children we were raising together. I said, "Claire, I hired an investigator after I found a hotel charge on an account I have every legal right to review, after I noticed months of changed behaviour I couldn't explain, after I chose for 5 months to gather facts instead of accusing you of something I couldn't yet prove. I did not photograph you doing anything. I did not fabricate anything. I simply documented what you were already doing, in a hotel 90 minutes from our house, with your business partner, while telling me and our children you were at conferences and closings. I am not the person who violated something in this marriage, Claire, and I think some part of you already knows that, even if you can't say it out loud yet." She cried at that point, and I want to be honest that watching her cry was hard, harder than I expected, because 14 years of marriage does not simply evaporate the moment you have proof of betrayal, and some old worn groove in me still wanted to comfort her, still wanted to cross the kitchen and put a hand on her shoulder the way I would have on any other night of our marriage when she was upset about something. I did not do that. I sat with the discomfort of wanting to comfort a woman who had spent months lying to me, and I let her cry without moving toward her, because I understood, even in that moment, that comforting her would have blurred a line I needed to keep clear, for my own sake and for the sake of everything that was about to come next. When she'd gathered herself enough to speak again, she tried a different approach, and this is the part of the story I think is most important for anyone listening who has been through something similar, because I think it's an extremely common pattern, and recognizing it in the moment mattered enormously to how the rest of that week went. She started trying to renegotiate the terms of what had just happened. Not the facts, she couldn't argue with the facts anymore, but the framing. She said, "Mark, okay, you're right, I should have told you I handled this terribly. But you have to understand this didn't come from nowhere. You were never home during the Harlow restructuring, you stopped really looking at me 2 years ago. I felt invisible in this marriage long before Trevor and I ever became anything. And I'm not saying that excuses what I did. But I need you to understand I didn't do this in a vacuum. We both let this marriage get to a place where something like this could even happen. I want to be honest about how I responded to that, because I think it's a genuinely difficult moment to navigate, the moment where the person who betrayed you starts constructing a version of events where the marriage's problems and the affair itself become blended together into one shared failure, so that the specific, deliberate choice to lie and deceive for the better part of a year gets softened into something more like a mutual drift that happened to both of us equally. I told her, "Claire, I've already told you I wasn't a perfect husband during those 2 years, and I meant that, and I still mean it. I worked too much. I was distracted at dinner more nights than I should have been. If you had come to me during that time and said, 'Mark, I feel invisible. I feel like we're drifting. I need you to show up differently,' I would have listened, and I think, honestly, I would have changed because I loved you enough to change for you. But you didn't do that. You didn't give me the chance to fix a problem you say you were having, because instead of telling me you felt unseen, You found someone who saw you, and you kept both versions of your life running in parallel for the better part of a year, rather than choosing one honestly. That's not a shared failure of a marriage drifting apart, Claire. That's a specific sustained decision you made, over and over, for months, to lie to me and to our children, rather than have an uncomfortable conversation with your husband. She didn't have an answer for that, not right away, and I watched her try several different angles over the following 20 minutes, each one a little more desperate than the last. She tried appealing to the children, saying we owed it to Nathan and Sophie to handle this quietly, privately, without lawyers, without a fight, as though the two of us could simply sit down like reasonable adults and work out an informal arrangement between ourselves, a suggestion that I understood even as she made it, was less about protecting the children and more about avoiding the formal legal process that would force full financial disclosure and independent scrutiny of exactly what had been happening with our shared money over the prior year. I told her I agreed completely that Nathan and Sophie deserved to be protected from as much conflict as possible, and that protecting them was exactly why I had already engaged an attorney, rather than trying to negotiate the end of our marriage across a kitchen table in the heat of a discovery that was only hours old for her, even though it was 5 months old for me. That was the moment I told her about Patricia. I want to describe her face in that exact instant, because I don't think I will ever forget it. I said, "Claire, I retained a family law attorney in May. Her name is Patricia Nolan. We have spent the last 3 months documenting our entire financial situation, building a fair proposed parenting plan that keeps Nathan and Sophie in their school and in this house through the end of the school year, and preparing a divorce petition. That petition was filed with the county clerk yesterday morning. You're going to be formally served with it in the next few days." The silence that followed that sentence was different from every silence that had come before it in that conversation. I watched something in Claire's understanding of the entire situation reassemble itself in real time, watched her realize that this was not a fresh, painful discovery she could still shape and manage through the coming weeks, that the decision had already been made, the paperwork already filed, the legal machinery already moving days before she'd ever walked into that kitchen. With her rehearsed announcement about wanting a divorce herself, she said, "You already filed. Before I even said anything to you. Mark, you let me stand here and tell you I wanted a divorce like I was the one making some kind of decision when you'd already decided this 3 months ago, and I told her, honestly, yes, because I wasn't going to let you control the timeline of the end of our marriage the same way you controlled the timeline of when I found out about the affair. You got to decide for 8 months when I would learn the truth. I decided, for the last 3 months, when you would learn that I already knew, and when the legal process would actually begin. I don't think that's cruelty, Claire. I think that's simply refusing to be the only person in this marriage operating without full information." She left the house that night around 10, driving off in the same grey sedan Ray had photographed in a hotel parking lot in Columbus, and I sat alone in our kitchen for a long time afterward, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, just profoundly tired in a way that felt like it had settled into my actual bones rather than just my mind. I picked up Nathan and Sophie from Claire's parents' house myself around 11, telling my in-laws only that Claire and I needed to talk some things through and that I'd take the kids home, and I remember carrying Sophie, half asleep, from the car into the house, her small arms around my neck, and thinking, with a clarity that has stayed with me since, that whatever came next, however messy or painful the following months turned out to be, protecting this exact feeling, my daughter's arms around my neck, my son's trust that his father had things handled, was the entire point of everything I had done for the previous 5 months. Claire came back the next morning, Thursday, while the kids were at school, and I want to describe that conversation too, because it was different in character from the one the night before, less shocked, more calculated, and in some ways more difficult to sit through, because I could see her actively strategizing in real time rather than simply reacting. She had clearly spent the night thinking, and possibly talking to someone, because the version of herself that walked into our kitchen that Thursday morning was noticeably more composed, more careful, and I understood within the first few minutes that she had shifted from damage reaction to damage control. She started by apologizing, and I want to be fair and say that some part of the apology sounded genuine. She cried again. She said she was sorry for the lying, sorry for what it would do to Nathan and Sophie, sorry that I'd carried this alone for 5 months while she had no idea I knew. But the apology moved within a few minutes into a different register, and she said, "Mark, I think we need to slow down on the legal side of this. I talked to a friend last night who went through a divorce, and she said once you start involving lawyers and formal filings, everything gets adversarial fast, and I don't want that for us. I don't want that for the kids. Can we agree to pause the legal process, at least the formal parts, and work out an arrangement between the two of us first, with a mediator maybe, someone neutral, instead of your attorney building a case against me? I told her calmly that Patricia was not building a case against her in the sense she meant, that Patricia's entire approach from the beginning had been oriented toward a fair, reasonable outcome specifically because a bitter, drawn-out fight served no one, least of all our children, but that I was not going to withdraw the petition or pause the legal process based on a conversation with an unnamed friend the night after she'd been caught in an 8-month affair. I said, Claire, I spent 5 months making sure that when this conversation happened, I would be operating from complete information and solid legal footing, and I'm not going to abandon that now because it would be more comfortable for you to negotiate informally in a kitchen with no attorney of your own present against a filed petition and 3 months of documentation you didn't know existed until yesterday. If you want to protect your interests in this, and you should, I told her, and I meant it, I'm not trying to leave you with nothing. Patricia has already built a settlement proposal. Patricia herself calls fair rather than aggressive. You need to get your own attorney and let the process work the way it's designed to work. She tried a different angle after that, and this is the part of the story that I think surprises people most when I tell it, because it reveals something about how thoroughly she had, even in the midst of falling apart, kept thinking several moves ahead. She said, Mark, if this goes to a custody discussion, I want you to think very carefully about what you plan to say about how you found all this out. Having someone followed, hiring an investigator, going through my accounts without telling me, a judge might not look at that as favourably as you think. You might come across as controlling, obsessive even, and I don't think you want that read into a custody evaluation any more than I want my affair read into it. I want to be honest that this attempt landed harder than anything else she said that week. Not because I doubted my own conduct. Patricia had been extremely clear from the beginning that everything I'd done was both legal and, if anything, evidence of restraint and good judgment rather than obsession. But because it was the first moment I understood, with total clarity, that Claire was not simply reacting to being caught, she was actively searching for leverage, actively trying to construct a version of events where my careful, methodical response to her affair could somehow be reframed as the more alarming behaviour in the relationship. I called Patricia that same afternoon and told her what Claire had said, and Patricia, to her credit, was almost amused. She said, Mr. Dawson, I've been doing this for 22 years, and I want you to understand something clearly. A spouse who documents a partner's infidelity through a licensed investigator, using legally obtained financial records they had a legitimate right to access in order to protect their children's stability and negotiate a fair settlement, is not a red flag in front of any judge in this county. A spouse who has been having a sustained affair for the better part of a year and is now trying to reframe her husband's diligence as controlling behaviour, in the same conversation where she's asking him to abandon his legal protections, that's the pattern judges have seen 1,000 times, and it does not work the way she's hoping it will. Stay the course. Trevor Holt entered the picture directly on Thursday evening, and I want to describe that conversation too because I think it's an important part of understanding how the entire structure of Claire's affair began to come apart, not just within our marriage but within her professional life as well. Trevor called me, not Claire, called my personal cell phone, a number I'm quite sure Claire had never given him but that he'd apparently found through some professional directory or mutual contact, and I almost didn't answer, but some part of me wanted to hear whatever he thought he had to say. He was initially conciliatory in a practiced professional way that reminded me uncomfortably of every real estate closing call I'd ever half listened to Claire have in the next room. He said, Mark, I know this is an incredibly difficult time, and I want you to know I never intended for anyone to get hurt. Claire and I never planned for this to happen. Sometimes people just connect in ways that surprise everyone involved, including us. I let him finish, and then I told him, with a level of calm that I think unsettled him more than anger would have, that I had a sworn statement from hotel staff describing him referring to my wife, in casual conversation, as basically like she was already his, that I had 8 to 10 months of documented meetings, and that I had also learned, from a colleague of Claire's, that this was not the first time he had done something like this in a relationship. I asked him directly, is that true? And there was a long pause on the line before he said quietly, that's not really relevant to this conversation, Mark, and I told him, actually, Trevor, I think it's the only relevant thing in this entire conversation, because it tells me everything I need to know about whether you actually connected with my wife in some unplanned, surprising way, or whether this is simply a pattern you've run before with someone else's marriage, and you're running it again now, with mine." He hung up shortly after that, and I did not hear from him again directly, though I would learn over the following weeks that his call to me had not been sanctioned by Claire at all, and that when she found out he'd contacted me personally, it caused what Jenny Ostrander later described to me as the first real crack in whatever bond had existed between them throughout the affair, because Claire apparently felt that Trevor calling me directly had made an already catastrophic situation more public and more dangerous for both of their professional standing at Ridgeline than it needed to be. Friday morning, a process server, a heavyset, courteous man named Guillermo, who I later learned had served papers professionally for 11 years and had a reputation for being unusually gentle about an inherently difficult job, arrived at Ridgeline Realty Group at 9:15 in the morning and formally served Claire with the divorce petition in the small conference room off the main lobby, at Patricia's careful arrangement, away from the open floor where other agents and clients might have witnessed it directly, though of course, in an office that size, very little stays contained for long. Claire called me an hour later, and her voice had a different quality than either the Wednesday night announcement or the Thursday morning negotiation, something flatter, something that sounded for the first time all week like a person who had actually run out of angles to try. She said, "It's real now, isn't it?" I said, "Claire, it's been real since Tuesday morning. Today is just the day you found out how real." I want to describe what happened at Ridgeline over the following 2 weeks, because I think it matters to the full shape of this story, even though I only know most of it secondhand, through Jenny and through Patricia, who had her own channels of information once the litigation was formally underway. Gordon Ridgeline, the 78-year-old founder who had mostly stepped back from daily operations, apparently reinserted himself directly into the brokerage's affairs, within days of the story becoming impossible to ignore around the office, not because of any moral crusade, Jenny told me, but because Gordon had built his business over 4 decades on a reputation for absolute discretion and trustworthiness with clients, and the specific detail that had emerged, that Trevor and Claire had used a vacant company listing as a private meeting location for months, sitting empty and unsold while it quietly served an entirely different purpose, represented, in Gordon's words according to Jenny, a direct misuse of client property and company resources that he was not willing to overlook, regardless of anyone's personal feelings about the affair itself. Trevor was asked to step down from his partnership within 3 weeks, a negotiated exit rather than a public firing, though everyone in the local real estate community understood exactly what had happened regardless of the official language used. Claire's position was more complicated, because she had not misused company property in the same direct way Trevor had. The hotel visits were on her own time even if the vacant listing showings crossed a clearer line, but the reputational damage inside a brokerage that depended heavily on small-town trust and referral relationships proved difficult to fully contain. She took what Jenny described as an extended leave of absence in September, technically voluntary, practically understood by everyone involved to be something closer to a graceful exit that avoided a messier conversation about her future at the company. She would eventually, I later learned, take a position at a much smaller brokerage 2 towns over, a step down in both prestige and income that represented, in a very direct financial sense, one more consequence of the previous year's decisions rippling forward into her professional life. I want to describe the actual meeting where Gordon Ridgeline confronted Trevor directly, because Jenny gave me a fairly detailed account of it weeks later, over coffee, and I think it illustrates something important about how thoroughly the consequences of that August week rippled outward into places I never expected them to reach. Gordon, 78 years old, walking with a cane by then after a hip replacement that had slowed him down considerably, called Trevor into the office that had once belonged to his own father, the office where the framed photograph of the original 1960s storefront still hung on the wall, and asked him a single question before anything else, according to Jenny, who'd heard the account second-hand from Gordon's longtime assistant. He asked, "Trevor, how many times did you and Claire use the property on Larkspur Court, the vacant listing, for something other than showing it to an actual client?" Trevor apparently tried to minimize the number at first, and Gordon, according to the assistant, simply set a printed record of the property's electronic lockbox access log on the desk between them, showing the exact dates and times the lockbox had been opened, none of which corresponded to any scheduled showing on the calendar, and said quietly, "I built this company on the idea that when a family lets us into their empty house, We treat that house like it still belongs to someone who trusts us completely. You didn't just betray your business partner's husband, Trevor. You used a family's empty home, a home they were counting on us to protect and sell with some dignity, as a place to carry on an affair that's not just personal, That's a violation of everything this company is actually built on, and I won't have it standing behind our name for one more day. I found out about that conversation almost a year after it happened, and I want to be honest about what it did to me hearing it, because it wasn't quite satisfaction, and it wasn't quite vindication either. It was something more like confirmation of a pattern I'd already suspected but hadn't had direct proof of. That Trevor's carelessness with what belonged to other people extended well beyond my marriage, into the actual physical property of families who had trusted Ridgeline Realty Group with something as significant as an empty home sitting between owners, and that Gordon Ridgeline, a man in his late 70s who could easily have looked the other way to avoid the disruption of losing a productive partner, chose instead to hold a line about what his company actually stood for. I think that mattered to me more than almost any other single consequence that landed on Trevor, because it wasn't punishment I had engineered or even asked for. It was simply what happened when the truth reached people who had their own reasons, entirely separate from mine, to care about it. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Nathan and Sophie, because I think it's the part of this story that mattered most to me, more than any legal victory or professional consequence that landed on Claire or Trevor. I did not want my children finding out about any of this from classmates, from overheard adult conversations, from the particular cruelty children can inflict on each other without fully understanding what they're repeating. Patricia and I had discussed weeks earlier, back when this was all still hypothetical preparation rather than lived reality, how I would handle exactly this conversation if it came to that, and she'd recommended a family therapist who specialised in helping children through divorce, a woman named Dr. Alicia Marsh, whose office was in a converted house near the elementary school, and who agreed to sit in on the first conversation with Nathan and Sophie to help make sure I said things in a way that gave them stability rather than fear. We sat down together, all four of us, Claire and I, on the Saturday after the service papers arrived, in Dr. Marsh's quiet, carefully decorated office with soft chairs and a box of tissues, placed with obvious intention on the low table between us. Nathan, 12 years old and sharp enough to have clearly already sensed something was wrong over the previous several days, asked almost immediately if we were getting divorced, a question delivered with the particular bluntness that children develop when they've decided that not knowing is worse than knowing something bad. Claire and I had agreed, in advance, on the language we would use, careful, simple, honest without being cruel, and I let her speak first, because I understood, even in that moment, that however angry I was about the previous 8 months, Nathan and Sophie needed to see their mother speaking to them with love and stability, not watch two adults use them as an audience for an ongoing fight. Claire told them, gently, that Mommy and Daddy loved them completely, and that would never change, that sometimes grown-ups grow apart in ways that aren't anyone's fault, and I watched Nathan's face as she said the phrase, not anyone's fault, watched something sceptical cross his 12-year-old features that told me, with a small ache in my chest, that some part of him already suspected the actual story was more complicated than that, though he didn't say anything yet. Sophie, 8 years old, asked the question that broke something open in me that I hadn't expected, which was simply, will I still have my room? And I told her, yes, sweetheart, you will always have your room, and whatever happens with grown-up things between Mommy and me, that will never change, and watching her small face relax at that specific, concrete reassurance taught me something about what actually matters to a child in the middle of a divorce that no amount of legal preparation had prepared me for. It's not the abstractions, it's the room, it's the school, it's whether the same stuffed animals are still allowed at the dinner table. Dr. Marsh guided us through the rest of that conversation with a steadiness I was grateful for, and afterward, in the parking lot, Claire and I stood together for a moment in a silence that felt different from any of the silences that had passed between us that entire week, less adversarial, more like two people who had just done something difficult together for the sake of two children. They both, whatever else had happened, genuinely loved. She said, "Thank you for letting me go first in there," and I told her, honestly, that I hadn't done it for her. I'd done it for Nathan and Sophie, because they needed to see their mother's love for them stay steady even while everything else was changing, and she nodded, and something in her face in that moment looked, for the first time all week, less like a woman managing a crisis, and more like a person actually grieving what she'd broken. I want to tell you about Claire's parents, because their reaction became its own small subplot in the weeks that followed, one I hadn't fully anticipated when I was planning out every other piece of this process with Patricia. Claire's mother, Diane Bennett, called me directly the Sunday after the Ridgeline service papers had gone out, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately place, and I braced myself, honestly, for anger on Claire's behalf, some version of a mother defending her daughter regardless of the facts. Instead, Diane said something I have thought about often since. She said, "Mark, Claire told her father and me everything last night, all of it, and I want you to know, before anything else gets said in this family, that we are heartbroken, and we are not heartbroken at you. I raised my daughter better than this, and I am ashamed, genuinely ashamed of some of what she's done, and I need you to know that whatever happens with the two of you legally, Frank and I are not going to pretend this was some mutual drifting apart to make anyone feel better. Claire made choices. We love her. We're going to support her through this process because she's our daughter, but we're not going to lie to ourselves or to you about what actually happened." That conversation mattered enormously to me, not because I needed Claire's parents' validation exactly, but because it confirmed something I'd suspected but hadn't been sure of, that the version of events Claire had tried to construct in our kitchen, the mutual drift, the shared failure, the marriage that simply ran its course, was not a version that survived contact with the people who knew her best and loved her most unconditionally. Diane and Frank continued to have a relationship with Nathan and Sophie throughout the entire process, continued hosting them on Wednesdays even as the broader arrangement shifted, and I made a point throughout everything that followed of never once suggesting to the children that seeing their grandparents should be complicated by anything happening between their parents, a boundary I was glad, in hindsight, that I'd held firmly from the very beginning. Mediation began in September, roughly 6 weeks after the Wednesday Claire had stood in our kitchen with her keys in her hand, and I want to describe the process honestly, because it was neither the vindictive war Claire had initially seemed to fear nor a simple, painless formality. We met, Claire and I, along with our respective attorneys and a court-appointed mediator, a calm, unflappable woman named Ruth Ann Pryor, who had clearly navigated hundreds of these rooms before and had a gift for redirecting conversations away from old grievances and back toward practical questions about two specific children's actual lives. The custody discussion, which I had privately feared would become the most contentious part of the entire process, actually resolved with less conflict than I'd braced for, in large part, Patricia told me afterward, because Claire's own attorney, a competent, no-nonsense man named Robert Okafor, had clearly counselled her early on that fighting aggressively for primary custody, given the documented pattern of deception and the specific detail of exposing the children indirectly to an ongoing affair through shared family time with Trevor's occasional presence at real estate community events, was a losing strategy that would only cost her money and credibility without changing the outcome. We settled on a custody arrangement that gave me primary residential parent status, with Claire receiving substantial and generous parenting time, alternating weekends, one weeknight dinner visit, extended time during summer and school breaks, an arrangement Patricia described as fair rather than punitive, built around what was actually best and most stable for Nathan and Sophie, rather than around any impulse to minimize Claire's role in their lives as some form of consequence for what she'd done. I want to be honest that I fought for this specific balance deliberately, because somewhere in those difficult months I had decided, clearly and firmly, that I was not interested in punishing Claire through our children, that Nathan and Sophie's relationship with their mother was theirs to build and protect regardless of what had happened between the two adults who made them, and that using custody as a weapon would have made me, in some fundamental way, exactly the kind of person I did not want to become on the other side of this. The financial settlement took longer to finalise, largely because of the dissipation of marital assets question Patricia had flagged all the way back in June. Robert Okafor initially pushed back hard on the $14,000 figure Ray's forensic accountant had documented, arguing that some portion of the hotel expenses could be attributed to legitimate business travel that happened to overlap with personal time, an argument that Patricia dismantled fairly efficiently by pointing to the specific dates, checkout times, and staggered arrival patterns that made the personal nature of those visits essentially undeniable in a courtroom setting. We eventually settled on a figure close to Ray's original estimate, applied as a credit in my favour during the division of our remaining marital assets, along with an agreement that the house on Kestrel Lane would remain in the children's stability for at least through Sophie's completion of elementary school, with Claire retaining a defined equity interest that would be settled when the house eventually sold or when Sophie moved on to middle school, whichever came first. I want to tell you about one moment during mediation that has stayed with me more than almost any other, because it revealed something about how thoroughly the entire structure of Claire's initial plan, the plan to be the one announcing the divorce, framing herself as the dissatisfied party finally finding the courage to leave, had actually depended on me never finding out the truth before she was ready to tell it. During a break in the third mediation session, standing in the hallway outside Ruth Ann Pryor's office while our attorneys reviewed a document, Claire said to me quietly, almost to herself, "I had it all planned out so differently, you know. I was going to tell you gently over months, ease you into the idea that we'd grown apart, let you feel like you'd had some say in how it ended, and then, eventually, once enough time had passed, tell you about Trevor separately, framed as something that happened after we'd already decided to separate rather than during. I had a whole timeline in my head for how this was supposed to go. I told her, and I meant it without any real anger left in the saying of it by that point, that I understood that completely, and that the entire plan had depended on one single assumption, which was that I would remain exactly as uninformed as she needed me to be for as long as she needed me to be that way, and that the actual undoing of her plan wasn't some dramatic confrontation or lucky accident. It was simply the fact that I had chosen, 5 months earlier, to stop being uninformed the moment I had a reasonable suspicion, rather than waiting for her to control when and how I learned the truth. I said, "Claire, your whole plan only worked if I stayed a step behind you the entire time, and I decided back in March that I wasn't willing to do that anymore, not because I wanted to hurt you, but because I refused to be the last person to understand my own life." I want to tell you what happened between Claire and Trevor over the following months, because it turned into its own small, almost predictable tragedy, and because I think it's relevant to anyone listening who imagines that an affair, once it's out in the open and no longer has to hide, simply transforms into a stable relationship built on whatever genuine connection existed underneath the deception. It did not work out that way for them, and I say that without any satisfaction, only observation. Once the affair became public knowledge around Ridgeline, once Trevor was eased out of his partnership and Claire took her leave of absence, the actual practical scaffolding that had supported their relationship for the better part of a year, the shared office, the excuse of business meetings, the vacant listing that had given them privacy without suspicion, simply disappeared, and what remained was two people who now had to build an actual relationship in the open, under scrutiny, without any of the structures that had made the secret version of it feel exciting rather than complicated. Jenny told me, in a phone call in early November, that Trevor had started distancing himself from Claire almost immediately once his own professional consequences became clear, a pattern Jenny said she recognised because, as she put it, some men are perfectly happy to be the exciting secret in someone else's marriage, but considerably less interested in being the difficult, publicly known reason a woman lost her career, her marriage, and a significant portion of her social standing in a town the size of Maple Ridge. I want to be careful here not to take too much satisfaction in this part of the story, because I don't think Claire's pain in that period, whatever its cause, was something I actually wanted, even after everything. But I would be lying if I said there wasn't a strange, complicated relief in learning that the version of events where Trevor had been some great, life-altering love worth blowing up her entire family for turned out to be considerably less durable than the actual family she'd had before any of this started. There was one moment, in late September, that I think captures the complicated shape of that period better than almost anything else. Claire called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice thick in a way that told me she'd been crying for a while before she dialed, and asked if she could come by, not for anything related to the custody schedule, just to talk. I let her come, partly out of some old habit of care I hadn't fully extinguished yet, and partly because Patricia had always advised me that maintaining basic civility and even occasional kindness toward Claire, especially in front of or adjacent to the children's awareness, served everyone's long-term interests far better than cold hostility would have. She sat in our kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd announced her rehearsed version of the divorce back in August, and she said, "Mark, I need to ask you something, and I need you to just answer honestly, even if it's not what I want to hear. Do you think if I hadn't gotten caught, if this had just gone on, do you think Trevor and I would have actually built something real? Or was I lying to myself the entire time?" I told her, honestly, that I didn't think that was a question I was in a position to answer for her, that I had no way of knowing what was actually in her heart during those 8 months, but that I could tell her what I'd observed from the outside, which was that whatever had existed between her and Trevor had required an enormous amount of secrecy. deception, and compartmentalization to survive, and that relationships built entirely inside those conditions rarely translate cleanly into something that can withstand daylight, public knowledge, and actual daily obligation, because the very qualities that made it feel exciting, the risk, the secrecy, the escape from ordinary domestic life, are the first things that disappear the moment it becomes ordinary and public itself. She sat with that for a long moment and then said, quietly, "I think I already knew that, actually. I think some part of me knew it back in July, and I kept going anyway, because stopping would have meant admitting I'd broken something I couldn't fix, and it was easier to keep moving forward than to turn around and look at what I'd already done. I want to be honest that this was, in some strange way, the closest thing to a real unguarded conversation Claire and I had during the entire process. More honest in its way than either the Wednesday announcement or the Thursday negotiation, because by late September, there was genuinely nothing left for either of us to strategize about. The settlement was largely finalized, the custody arrangement was set, and what remained was simply two people who had built 14 years of a life together trying to understand, honestly, what had actually happened to it. I did not comfort her that night in any physical way. I want to be clear about that. I did not cross whatever line remained between us, but I did tell her, before she left, that I hoped she found whatever she'd actually been looking for during those 8 months genuinely, because whatever it was, it clearly hadn't been Trevor, and I hoped, for her own sake and for Nathan and Sophie's sake, that she figured out what it actually was before it cost her something else she couldn't get back. By November, Claire had moved into a rental townhouse about 15 minutes from Kestrel Lane, close enough to remain easily involved in Nathan and Sophie's daily lives, which I want to note, because I think it reflects something true about her that got lost in the chaos of that August week, that whatever she had done wrong in our marriage, she never once, throughout the entire process, showed anything less than complete, genuine devotion to our children. I've never doubted, in the time since, that Claire loves Nathan and Sophie as much as I do, and I have made a point, in every conversation I've had with the kids since the divorce became final, of never once suggesting otherwise, because I think children of divorce carry enough weight without also being asked to choose a side in a story that, at its core, was never actually about them. The divorce became final in the middle of January, 5 months after that Wednesday night in the kitchen, which meant, when I sat down and actually did the math one evening at my desk, that the entire process from the moment Patricia filed the initial petition to the moment a judge signed the final decree had taken almost exactly 6 months, a timeline Patricia told me was, if anything, faster and cleaner than the overwhelming majority of contested divorces she'd handled in her 22 years of practice, a fact she attributed directly to the 5 months of preparation that had preceded the filing itself. I remember sitting in the courthouse hallway the morning the decree was finalized, waiting outside the courtroom with Patricia beside me, reviewing a final document, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, which was not victory, and not relief exactly either, but a kind of quiet, settled exhaustion, the specific feeling of having carried something extremely heavy, for a very long distance, and finally being allowed to set it down. There was one last moment in the hallway I want to tell you about, because I think it closes something in this story that needed closing. Claire was there too, of course, with Robert Okafor beside her, and while our attorneys spoke briefly to each other about some final scheduling detail, she turned to me and said, quietly, "For what it's worth, Mark, I don't think I ever really understood, until this whole process, what it actually meant that you were the kind of person who does things carefully, all the way through, before he acts. I used to think it made you a little rigid, honestly. Back when things were good between us, I used to tease you about being my personal auditor, remember? And I think some part of me genuinely believed, this whole time, that if you ever found out about Trevor, you'd fall apart the way I imagined most men would, and I'd have time in that chaos to manage the outcome. I didn't account for the fact that the exact same carefulness I used to find a little exhausting about you was going to be the thing that made sure I never actually got that chance. I told her honestly that I appreciated her saying that, and that I didn't take any particular pride in how methodically I'd handled it, because I would have traded every ounce of that careful preparation for a version of the last 2 years where none of it had ever been necessary in the first place. I said, Claire, I didn't build a legal case against you because I wanted to win something. I built it because the moment I found that hotel receipt in March, I understood that I was either going to spend the next several months finding out the actual truth on solid ground, or I was going to spend them getting slowly gaslit by a version of events designed to keep me confused for as long as possible, and I decided a long time ago that I would rather know an unbearable truth than live comfortably inside a lie, even a well-intentioned one. She nodded at that, and we didn't say much else to each other in that hallway, and when the judge finalised the decree 20 minutes later, it was, in the end, a remarkably quiet, almost anticlimactic legal formality, 14 years of marriage ending with a signature and a case number, which I think is probably exactly how it should end, quietly, on paper, long after all the actual emotional work of ending it has already happened somewhere else, in a kitchen, in a hallway, in 5 months of careful, lonely preparation nobody but Patricia and Ray ever fully witnessed. I want to describe the specific texture of the months that followed, because I think the aftermath of something like this matters just as much as the dramatic week that precipitated it, and because I don't want anyone listening to this to think that the story simply ends at the courthouse with some clean, triumphant close. Rebuilding a life with 2 children, primary custody, a full-time job, and an entirely reorganised understanding of what my own future was supposed to look like was, for the first several months, genuinely hard in ways that had nothing to do with Claire or Trevor at all. I had to learn Sophie's actual morning routine in a level of granular detail I'd never needed before, because for years Claire had quietly managed most of it, while I got the kids to school maybe one morning in 5, and now I was doing it every single day, learning which specific hair ties Sophie would tolerate without a meltdown, learning that Nathan needed exactly 11 minutes of quiet before he was willing to talk about anything that had actually bothered him at school that day. I burned dinner more times that first autumn than I'm entirely comfortable admitting, and I remember standing over a smoking pan of what was supposed to be chicken. One October evening, Sophie watching me with the patient, slightly concerned expression of an 8-year-old assessing her father's competence in real time, and thinking, with a kind of exhausted, unexpected laugh, that this, exactly this, burnt chicken and a concerned 8-year-old, was somehow easier to carry than a single day of the previous 5 months had been, because at least this exhaustion was honest, uncomplicated by secrets, uncomplicated by a wife across the table who was somewhere else entirely in her head. I want to be honest about my own emotional health during that period too, because I think men in particular, telling a story like this one, sometimes leave out the part where they needed actual help processing it, as though the entire story is supposed to be a clean demonstration of stoic competence from start to finish. It wasn't. I started seeing a therapist myself in October, a quiet, unassuming man named Dr. Philip Warshaw, whose office was 2 doors down from Dr. Marsh's practice, and I want to describe the first session honestly, because I almost cancelled it twice before actually going. I sat down across from him, and the first thing he asked was not about Claire or Trevor, or the divorce at all. He asked me how I was sleeping, and I told him, honestly, that I wasn't, not really, that I'd fall asleep fine most nights, but wake at 3 or 4 in the morning with my mind immediately running through some fragment of the previous August, the exact words Claire had used, the exact expression on her face when I said Trevor's name, replaying it the way you replay a car accident you walked away from, but can't stop reconstructing anyway. Doctor. Warshaw told me something in that first session that reframed the entire process for me in a way I hadn't expected. He said, "Mark, you did an extraordinary job managing the practical legal side of an incredibly difficult situation. Genuinely extraordinary, I don't say that lightly. But I want you to understand something important. Managing a crisis well and processing a crisis well are 2 completely different skills, and it's entirely possible to be excellent at the first one while still needing significant help with the second. And there's no contradiction in that at all. The same discipline that let you sit on this information for 5 months without acting rashly may have also required you to suppress an enormous amount of grief during that same period. Grief you're only now getting the chance to actually feel because the practical emergency has finally passed. That reframing helped me more than I expected it to, because I had, without fully realising it, been quietly ashamed of how hard those months after the divorce still felt, some part of me assuming that because I'd handled the strategic side so competently, I should have been equally composed emotionally, and Dr. Warshaw's distinction between those 2 different kinds of competence gave me permission to actually grieve the marriage itself, separately from the legal process of ending it, the ordinary Tuesday dinners that would never happen again, the specific sound of Claire's laugh that I still, honestly, sometimes missed, even while knowing everything I knew about what she'd done. I worked with him for almost a year and a half, on and off, tapering down as things stabilised, and I credit a significant portion of the actual peace I feel now, 3 years out from that kitchen conversation, to the fact that I did that work deliberately rather than simply assuming that winning the practical battle meant the emotional war was automatically over too. My own parents, particularly my mother, were an enormous source of support during that stretch, driving over from their place across town 2 or 3 times a week that first fall to help with homework and dinner and the particular chaos of a household still finding its new rhythm. And I remember my mother saying to me one evening, watching me finally get both kids down without incident for the first time in what felt like weeks, "Mark, you know, your father and I always thought Claire was wonderful, and I still think there was a wonderful person in there. I just think somewhere along the way she made a choice that wasn't wonderful at all, and you don't have to hate her to understand that both of those things can be true at once." I've held on to that sentence more than almost anything else anyone said to me during that whole period, because I think it's the most honest, least bitter way I've found to hold the entire situation, without either pretending Claire was some simple villain or pretending what she did wasn't a genuine, serious betrayal that reshaped every single one of our lives. I want to describe one more piece of that autumn, because I think it rounds out the picture of what rebuilding an ordinary life actually looks like after something this disruptive, and because it involves a woman named Marla Whitcomb who ran the front desk at Nathan's middle school and who, entirely unprompted, became one of the quiet, steady adults who helped hold that first year together. Marla noticed within the first few weeks of the new school year that I was the one dropping off and picking up both kids almost every single day now, a shift from the previous pattern where Claire had handled most of the mornings, and rather than treating it as none of her business, which it technically was, she made a point of remembering both kids' names, asking about Nathan's classes specifically, and mentioning gently one afternoon when I came to pick up a forgotten lunch, that she'd been through her own divorce 11 years earlier as the parent who suddenly had to learn an entire new daily rhythm from scratch, and that it does get easier, not quickly, but steadily, in a way you mostly only notice in hindsight rather than while you're living through the hardest part of it. I think about Marla Whitcomb more than the size of her actual role in this story might suggest, because she represents something I noticed repeatedly throughout that entire year, which is how many ordinary people, teachers, neighbours, a checkout clerk at the grocery store who started recognising Sophie and me from our new twice-weekly routine, quietly extended small kindnesses during that period without ever needing to know the full story behind why a father was suddenly handling every school pickup alone. I don't think Maple Ridge is a uniquely kind town, though I'm certainly biased toward believing it is. I think, more likely, that most towns are full of people willing to extend exactly that kind of quiet, unremarked decency to a family they can tell is going through something difficult if you simply let them see you clearly enough to offer it, which is its own kind of lesson I took from that year, that rebuilding a life after a betrayal like this one does not happen in isolation, no matter how private the legal and emotional work of it might feel while you're doing it. It happens surrounded by dozens of small unglamorous acts of ordinary support from people who will mostly never know the full shape of what they helped carry. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Nathan in the spring, about 8 months after everything, because I think it's one of the moments that actually taught me something new about the entire ordeal rather than simply confirming what I already understood. Nathan had turned 13 by then, and 13-year-olds, I was learning, process things very differently than 12-year-olds do, with a sharper, more analytical edge that sometimes caught me completely off guard. We were driving back from a baseball practice, just the two of us, and out of nowhere, staring out the passenger window, he said, "Dad, did you know about Mom and Trevor before she told us that day at Dr. Marsh's office?" I want to be honest that I hadn't planned for this question, hadn't rehearsed an answer the way I'd rehearsed so much else during those months, and I decided, in the space of about 2 seconds, that Nathan deserved the truth rather than a carefully managed version of it. I told him, yes, I had known for a while before that, and I watched him process that information with the same sharp, quiet intensity he brings to a math problem he's determined to solve without help. He asked why I hadn't said anything sooner, to him or to Mom, and I explained it to him the way I would explain it to an adult, scaled down slightly but not condescendingly, that I had wanted to understand the full truth before I did anything at all, that acting on half information usually makes things worse rather than better, and that I had made a deliberate choice to gather everything I needed to protect our family, him and Sophie specifically, before I said a single word to anyone. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that genuinely surprised me, delivered with the blunt clarity that seems to arrive suddenly somewhere in the 13th year of a person's life. He said, "That actually makes sense, Dad. I think if you'd just yelled at her right when you found out, everything would have been way messier, and Sophie was already having a hard enough time. I think you did it the smart way." I want to be honest that hearing my own 13-year-old son articulate, more clearly than I sometimes manage to articulate it to myself, the actual reasoning behind those 5 difficult months was one of the more unexpectedly moving moments of that entire year. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and that I hoped, whatever happened in his own life someday, in relationships or friendships or any hard situation he ever found himself in, that he'd remember that finding out the truth carefully is almost always better than reacting fast to a feeling, even when the truth takes a long time and a lot of patience to actually get to. He nodded, in that specific way teenagers nod when they've decided a piece of advice is actually worth keeping rather than simply worth tolerating. And we didn't talk about it again for a long while after that, though I noticed, in small ways over the following months, that Nathan seemed to carry himself with a steadiness about the whole situation that Sophie, younger and less equipped to process the specifics, took considerably longer to arrive at. I ran into Trevor Holt exactly once after everything settled, in the parking lot of the hardware store on 5th Street, of all places, both of us there on an ordinary Saturday morning for entirely unrelated reasons. And I want to describe that encounter because I think it says something final and important about how these things actually resolve in real life, as opposed to how satisfying it might feel to imagine them resolving. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, and there was none of the easy practice charm I remembered from those holiday parties years earlier. He nodded at me, a small, awkward acknowledgement, and I nodded back, and neither of us said anything at all, and I remember getting into my truck afterward and waiting for some surge of anger or satisfaction to arrive, some emotional payoff for the moment, and instead feeling almost nothing, a kind of clean, uncomplicated indifference that surprised me more than any other feeling could have. I understood, sitting there in that parking lot, that Trevor Holt had simply stopped mattering to me, not because I'd forgiven him exactly, but because he had never actually been the centre of this story in the way I might have expected him to be. The centre of this story had always been Claire and me and the specific choice I'd made to handle the worst thing that ever happened to my marriage with patience instead of panic. Trevor was, in the end, simply a name in a folder Ray Coleman had built for me, a minor character in a story that was really about something else entirely. Professionally, I want to note this entire experience changed the way I do my own job at Harlow in ways I didn't expect. I found myself, in the 2 years since, considerably more patient with junior analysts who want to rush a recommendation to leadership before they've fully modelled out every contingency, more willing to say, out loud in meetings, "Let's make sure we actually know this before we act on it." A phrase that has become something of a personal motto around the office, half joking, half completely serious, that a few colleagues have told me they've started using themselves. I was promoted to Director of Financial Planning in the spring after the divorce finalised, a promotion I genuinely believe had nothing to do with anything that happened in my personal life, but that I also can't fully separate from the specific discipline those 5 months demanded of me. The discipline of sitting with an unbearable, unresolved question and refusing to act until I actually had an answer worth acting on. I want to tell you about Sophie, specifically, because her processing of all of this took the longest and in some ways worried me the most. For the first several months after the divorce, Sophie seemed remarkably unaffected on the surface, cheerful, adaptable in the particular resilient way young children sometimes are, and it wasn't until nearly a year after that Wednesday night in the kitchen, in the following summer, that something surfaced that told me she'd been carrying more than she'd shown. She came home from a friend's house one afternoon, 9 years old by then, and asked me out of nowhere while I was making dinner whether it was her fault that Mommy and I got divorced, because a friend had told her that sometimes parents split up because kids are too much trouble, a piece of casual, thoughtless cruelty from another 9-year-old that had apparently lodged itself in Sophie's mind for weeks before she finally said it out loud to me. I turned off the stove and sat down with her right there at the kitchen table, and I told her, as clearly and as firmly as I know how to tell a 9-year-old anything, that nothing that happened between her mother and me had one single thing to do with her or with Nathan, that it was entirely about choices 2 grown-ups made, and that she and her brother were, without any exception, without any qualification, the very best thing that had come out of that marriage, the thing neither Mum nor I would ever, under any circumstances, take back or regret for one single second. I told her that grown-up problems are never a kid's fault, not ever, not even a little bit, and that anyone who ever tells her otherwise, even a friend who doesn't understand what she's saying, is simply wrong about something very important. She cried for a little while, the specific unguarded crying of a child finally allowed to release something she'd been holding privately, and then she asked if she could have extra dessert, which I took, and still take, as a fairly reliable sign that the worst of that particular worry had actually lifted. I called Claire that same evening and told her what Sophie had said, because I believed, and still believe, that co-parenting well after something like this means making sure both parents know what their children are actually carrying, regardless of who caused the original wound. Claire was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said, thickly, "I'll talk to her this weekend, and I want you to know, Mark, hearing that just now might be the worst moment of this entire year for me, worse than the hallway at the courthouse, worse than losing my job at Ridgeline, because I never once, in 8 months of the worst decision of my life, thought about what it might eventually cost Sophie to simply exist inside the wreckage of it." I told her, honestly, that I appreciated her saying that, and that the most useful thing either of us could do now was simply make sure Sophie and Nathan never doubted, for one single day going forward, that they were loved completely by both of us, regardless of anything else that had happened. I want to describe a smaller, quieter part of the story now because I think it matters, even though it happened well outside the dramatic week that this story is really about. About 7 months after the divorce finalised, I started seeing someone, a woman named Ellen Voss, a physical therapist I met, in a way that still makes me laugh a little, through Nathan's baseball team, where her son played shortstop 2 positions over from where Nathan played second base. I want to be honest that I was in no hurry to date again, that the months right after the divorce were almost entirely occupied with rebuilding a stable, functional household for 2 children who needed exactly that more than they needed anything else from me, and that when Ellen and I did eventually start spending time together, it happened slowly, carefully, in a way that I think mirrors almost everything else about how I moved through that entire period of my life. Ellen had her own divorce behind her, 5 years earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with infidelity, simply 2 people who married too young and grew into incompatible versions of themselves, and I found, talking with her over that first slow year of knowing each other, that there was a particular relief in being with someone who understood from her own experience the specific exhaustion of rebuilding an entire life around 2 children's stability, without any real map for how to do it. I introduced Ellen to Nathan and Sophie carefully, almost a full year into knowing her, only after I was genuinely certain this was something durable rather than something that might disappear and take one more piece of stability away from 2 kids who had already lost enough of that in one difficult year. Nathan, practical as ever, mostly wanted to know if Ellen's son would still be on his baseball team next season. Sophie took longer to warm up, watchful in the particular way children of divorce often are around a parent's new partner. But Ellen, to her enormous credit, never once tried to rush that process, never positioned herself as any kind of replacement for Claire, simply showed up consistently, patiently, over months, until Sophie decided, on her own timeline, that Ellen was someone safe to like. There was a moment of real tension between Claire and me that surfaced again about 9 months after the divorce finalised, and I want to include it here because I think it's important not to present the aftermath of something like this as a smooth, uninterrupted march toward peaceful co-parenting, when the truth is considerably messier than that. Claire called me in the fall, roughly 14 months after that Wednesday in the kitchen, and asked, in a tone I recognised instantly from the negotiation phase of the original divorce, whether we could revisit the custody schedule, because her new position at the smaller brokerage 2 towns over had stabilised enough that she felt ready to request additional time with Nathan and Sophie, closer to a fully equal split than the arrangement we'd settled on the previous year. I want to be honest that my first instinct was defensive, a flash of the old wariness from that August week returning instantly, wondering whether this was a genuine, healthy desire for more time with her children, or another attempt to renegotiate terms she'd agreed to under different circumstances. I called Patricia, even though the divorce itself was long finalised, because modifying a custody arrangement is its own legal process, and Patricia, characteristically direct, told me, "Mark, before you decide how to respond to this, ask yourself honestly whether Claire's request is actually reasonable on its own merits, separate from how you feel about her, because judges evaluate modification requests based on the children's best interest now, not based on anyone's conduct 18 months ago, and if you fight a reasonable request purely out of old resentment, That's the kind of thing that can actually work against you. I sat with that advice for several days, and I want to be honest about the internal work it took to actually separate my lingering feelings about the affair from an honest assessment of what Claire was asking for. When I finally looked at it clearly, I realised her request was, in fact, reasonable. She'd stabilised professionally. She had, by every account from Nathan and Sophie themselves, been a consistently present, loving parent throughout every visit and every scheduled evening since the divorce. The kids, when I asked them carefully, separately, without leading either of them toward any particular answer, both said they'd like more time with their mother, Nathan phrasing it with his usual bluntness. "I just miss her on the weeks I don't see her much, Dad. It's not about you," and Sophie simply saying she wished bedtime stories with Mom happened more than every other week. I agreed to the modification, and Claire and I worked out, with Patricia and Robert Okafor handling the formal paperwork, a schedule closer to an even split, alternating weeks rather than the original weekend and one-weeknight arrangement. And I want to be honest that agreeing to it required me to actually confront something uncomfortable in myself, which was that some small part of me had been holding on to the original, more favourable custody arrangement, not purely because it was best for the children at that specific moment 18 months earlier, but partly because it had felt, in some quiet way I hadn't fully admitted to myself, like a form of justice for what she'd done. Recognising that in myself and choosing to let go of it once it was no longer actually serving Nathan and Sophie's best interest was its own kind of difficult, necessary growth that I don't think I could have managed in the raw early months right after the discovery, and I think that's worth saying honestly, that healing from something like this is not a single decision made once in a kitchen. It's a long series of smaller decisions made over years about how much of your justified anger you're willing to keep carrying once it stops actually protecting anyone. The house on Kestrel Lane eventually sold, about 2 years after the divorce, once Sophie had finished elementary school, and the specific stability that particular house represented had served its purpose. I want to describe selling that house honestly, because it was harder than I expected, walking through those empty rooms one last time with the realtor, a colleague of Claire's from her new brokerage rather than anyone from Ridgeline, and seeing the pencil marks still on the hall closet doorframe where we'd tracked Sophie's height every year since she was 2, marks the new owner's agent said, kindly, they'd probably paint over during the walkthrough, and I remember asking if I could photograph them first, standing there with my phone taking a picture of a doorframe like it was something precious, which I suppose it was. I used part of my share of the proceeds, along with the settlement Patricia had secured regarding the dissipation of marital assets, as the down payment on a smaller house across town, closer to Nathan's middle school, and eventually closer to Ellen's place as well, a fresh start that felt, by that point, less like an ending and more like an actual beginning, the first one I'd gotten to choose entirely on my own terms in 14 years. I want to say something about Ray Coleman and Patricia Nolan here, because I don't think this story's complete without acknowledging what they actually did for my family, beyond the technical services either of them was paid for. I ran into Ray, purely by accident, at a diner near the highway, about 2 years after everything had settled, and he remembered me instantly, asked how the kids were doing by name, Nathan and Sophie, a detail that told me he genuinely kept track of the families whose lives he'd stepped into for a few difficult months, rather than simply filing them away as closed cases. I told him things had settled into something stable and good, and he said, "Mr. Dawson, I want you to know, out of everyone I've worked with in 15 years of doing this job, you're one of maybe 3 or 4 people I still think about, because most people come to me already halfway to falling apart, and you came to me asking for a process, a methodical, unemotional process, and you actually stuck to it for 5 straight months without breaking. And I've watched a lot of people say they want that kind of discipline, and then abandon it the second the first photograph lands on my desk. I told him honestly that I didn't feel disciplined during most of those 5 months. I felt like I was barely holding together some nights, and he said, "That's usually what real discipline actually looks like from the inside, Mr. Dawson. It rarely feels like strength while you're doing it. It just feels like refusing to quit on a decision you already made." Patricia and I still exchange a card at the holidays, a small, ordinary gesture that I think reflects something true about how much that relationship mattered during a period when I genuinely did not know who else to trust with the entire truth of what was happening in my life. She told me once, near the very end of the process, over what ended up being our final build meeting before the divorce finalised, that she'd handled hundreds of cases in 22 years of practice, and that the single biggest variable in whether a divorce destroyed a family or simply reorganized it was almost never the severity of what had caused it — infidelity, financial betrayal, any of the ordinary catastrophic reasons marriages end, but rather whether the wrong spouse could manage to stay oriented toward the children's actual welfare, instead of toward punishing the other parent, even while they were still furious, even while every instinct told them to make the other person suffer as much as they themselves were suffering. She said, "Mr. Dawson, you did that about as well as I've seen anyone do it, and I've told my associates about your case more than once, as an example of how this process is supposed to work when it works the way it's actually designed to. I want to tell you about Nathan's 14th birthday, because it happened almost exactly 2 years after the Wednesday in the kitchen, and because it was, in a small, quiet way, the first moment where I actually felt, rather than simply believed intellectually, that our family had genuinely healed into something stable rather than merely functional. We had a small gathering at the house, just family, my parents, Claire's parents, Claire herself, Ellen, a handful of Nathan's closest friends, and I remember standing in the backyard that afternoon watching Claire and Ellen actually laughing together at something near the drink cooler, an easy, unforced laugh between two women who had every reason in the world to feel awkward around each other, and had instead, over nearly 2 years of careful, patient effort on everyone's part, built something that at least resembled genuine civility, maybe even the early edges of something like friendship, entirely in service of making sure Nathan never had to feel at his own birthday party, like he was navigating a minefield between the adults who loved him. Claire found me near the grill at one point, both of us watching Nathan attempt and fail and attempt again to teach his little sister how to properly throw a football, and she said, quietly, watching them, "You know, I used to think the worst thing that could have happened to our family was you finding out about Trevor. I've come to think, actually, that the worst thing would have been you never finding out at all, or finding out some other way, some uglier way, years later, after even more damage had been done. The way you handled it, as much as it terrified me that week, might honestly be the only reason we're standing here today at our son's birthday, actually able to be in the same yard together without it being unbearable for the kids." I told her honestly that I'd thought about that too more than once, that there was a version of this story where I confronted her in a rage the moment I found that hotel receipt in March, where the entire process became an ugly, protracted war that cost the kids far more than the careful, methodical version actually had, and that I didn't know, even now, whether I'd made the right choice out of wisdom or just out of temperament, but that I was grateful, regardless of which it was, that it had led us to a backyard where our son could learn to throw a football with his sister, without either of his parents making it about anything except him. I want to be honest about something before I move toward the end of this story, which is that I do not consider myself some kind of hero in this narrative, and I want to push back gently against any version of this story that frames me that way. I did not handle the discovery of my wife's affair with some superhuman grace that other people simply lack. I handled it the way I handle everything in my life, methodically, because that is simply who I am. The same temperament that makes me good at reconciling budget projections at Harlow is the same temperament that let me sit on a devastating piece of information for 5 months without acting rashly on it. I think, if anything, the actual lesson in this story isn't really about me at all. It's about the fact that whoever controls the information in a crisis controls the outcome of that crisis, and that patience, real patience, the kind that costs you something every single day you practice it, is very rarely comfortable and very rarely feels like strength while you're living inside it. But it is, in my direct experience, almost always worth more in the end than the temporary relief of reacting immediately to a wound the moment it opens. Ellen and I got married almost exactly 3 years after that Wednesday night in the kitchen. A small ceremony at her sister's house, out near the reservoir. Nothing like the mason jar and string lights wedding Claire and I had at her parents' church all those years ago, but its own kind of good, quiet, deliberately unhurried the way most good things in my life since that difficult year have turned out to be. I asked both Nathan and Sophie, separately and honestly, months before I ever proposed to Ellen, how they would feel about it. Not because I needed their permission exactly, but because I had learned, through that entire brutal process, that the children in a story like this one are never simply passengers. They are full participants whose feelings deserve to be taken seriously rather than managed after the fact. Nathan, 15 by then, and considerably more articulate than he'd been at 12, told me he liked Ellen, that she'd never once tried to be his mother or compete with his mother, that she just showed up and was steady and kind, and that as far as he was concerned, that was exactly the bar a person should have to clear. Sophie, 11, asked mostly practical questions, whether she'd have to change her last name, which she wouldn't, whether Ellen's son would technically be her stepbrother, which he would, and whether that meant she got to go to more of his hockey games, which, delighted, it did. Claire came to the wedding, which I want to note not because it was expected or unremarkable, but because I think it represented the actual hard-won end point of everything that had happened between us. She sat with her own parents, danced once with Nathan, who insisted on it, and found me near the end of the evening to say simply, "I'm happy for you, Mark, genuinely, and I don't say that easily, because some small, selfish part of me will probably always wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices back then. But I've watched you build something steady and good out of the worst thing I ever did to you, and I think Nathan and Sophie are lucky to have watched that happen too, because it taught them something about resilience that I don't think I could have taught them nearly as well myself." I told her, honestly, that I appreciated her being there, and that whatever complicated history existed between us, I would always be grateful that she had, in the years since that August, become someone Nathan and Sophie could rely on completely, because that mattered more to me, in the end, than anything else that had happened between the two of us as a couple. I think often about what I would say to another man sitting exactly where I sat in March of that year, staring at a hotel receipt that didn't add up, feeling the first cold edge of a suspicion he desperately wants to be wrong about. I would tell him, first, that the instinct to know fully and completely before you act is not coldness, and it is not calculation in the cynical sense of that word. It is simply respect for yourself, for your own life, for the fact that you deserve to make the biggest decisions of your future from a position of clarity rather than from a position of panic that someone else has deliberately engineered to keep you off balance. I would tell him that hiring an investigator, consulting an attorney, gathering documentation, none of that makes you paranoid or vindictive. It makes you someone who understands that trust, once it's actually been broken, has to be replaced with something more solid than a feeling. Because feelings can be manipulated by someone skilled enough at managing your emotional state, and documented facts cannot. I would tell him that the goal was never to win, was never to make the other person suffer as much as I had suffered, was never even really about Claire at all in the end. The goal, from the very first night I lay awake next to her, running Patricia's checklist through my head, was always Nathan and Sophie, always making sure that whatever happened to their parents' marriage, they would land somewhere stable, somewhere fair, somewhere neither of their parents had used them as a weapon against the other. I would tell him one more thing. The thing I think about most now, years later, on the ordinary quiet evenings when none of this crosses my mind at all, until something small triggers the memory. A hotel commercial on television, the specific model of car Trevor used to drive, a booth in a diner that reminds me, in some indirect way, of that first terrible week. I would tell him that the version of himself who gets through something like this intact is not the version who never feels anger, never feels grief, never wants, in some dark 3 a.m. moment, to simply burn the whole thing down out of pure wounded pride. It is the version who feels every single bit of that, completely, honestly, and chooses again and again, methodically, patiently, to act on the careful plan instead of the immediate feeling, because the plan is what actually protects the people who matter, and the feeling, however justified, almost never does. I want to go back, before I close this out, to something I glossed over in the middle of telling you all this, because I think it deserves its own fuller telling rather than being buried in the sequence of everything else, and that is the exact texture of the year that followed the divorce becoming final, the specific, unglamorous work of building an entirely new daily architecture for 2 children who had, in the span of a single difficult August, lost the only version of family life they'd ever known. I want to describe an ordinary Tuesday from that first spring, chosen almost at random except that I remember it clearly, because I think ordinary days tell you more about whether a family is actually healed than any single dramatic milestone does. I woke at 6, got Sophie's hair into the specific braid she'd finally decided she could tolerate, packed Nathan's lunch with the sandwich cut in the diagonal halves he insisted mattered enormously, despite refusing to explain why, drove them both to school, sat through a full day of budget meetings at Harlow where nobody in the building knew or needed to know anything about what had happened in my personal life that year, picked the kids up, sat through Nathan's homework and Sophie's spelling words, made a completely unremarkable dinner that did not burn, and put both kids to bed at a reasonable hour without incident. I remember standing in my kitchen afterward, the dishes done, the house quiet, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel again for a long time after that August, which was simply contentment. Ordinary, unremarkable contentment. The specific flavour of peace that comes from a day where nothing dramatic happened at all, and understanding in that exact moment that this, precisely this, boring, uneventful, entirely stable, was what all 5 months of careful preparation the previous year had actually been for. Not the courtroom, not the settlement, not even the custody arrangement itself, just this. An ordinary Tuesday where 2 children got to be children, entirely unaware of how much careful, deliberate work had gone into making sure their Tuesday could be this boring. I think about the version of that year where I'd made different choices constantly. Not with regret exactly, but with a kind of clinical curiosity. The same instinct that makes me run alternate scenarios on a budget projection at work. If I had confronted Claire the night I found that hotel receipt in March, if I had let the rage and hurt of that moment drive the conversation instead of 5 months of careful preparation, I think, honestly, we would have ended up in the same place eventually, divorced, Nathan and Sophie split between 2 households, Trevor eventually fading out of the picture once the affair lost its secret forbidden texture. But I think the path there would have been considerably uglier, considerably more expensive, considerably more damaging to the children who had no say in any of it, because an angry, wounded man reacting in the moment tends to make decisions that feel satisfying for about a day and cost him dearly for years afterward, while a man who insists on knowing the entire truth before he moves tends to make decisions that feel almost unbearably restrained in the moment and pay off steadily for the rest of his life. I know which version of that year I'm glad I actually lived through, even though it asked more patience of me than I sometimes believed I had. There is a particular question people ask me now, when they eventually learn some version of this story, usually framed some version of, weren't you tempted to just confront her the second you found out? Wouldn't it have felt better to just scream at her in that kitchen in March instead of waiting 5 more months? I understand the question completely, because I asked it of myself more times than I can count during those 5 months, lying awake at 2 a.m. next to a woman I now knew was lying to me, wanting nothing more in the entire world than to simply say the words out loud and watch her face crumble right then, immediately, on my own timeline instead of hers. But I always come back to the same answer, the same one I gave Patricia in May, the same one I've given my own son now that he's old enough to understand it. Confronting her in March would have felt like justice for about 1 evening. It would have given me a single night of watching her face fall apart, and then it would have handed her the next 5 months to construct whatever version of events best protected her, to hide assets, to build a sympathetic narrative among mutual friends, to potentially fight for a custody arrangement built on a wounded husband's messy public meltdown, rather than a documented pattern of deception. Waiting cost me 5 months of private agony that nobody but Ray and Patricia ever saw. It bought me an entire lifetime of Nathan and Sophie growing up in a stable, fairly divided, carefully protected version of a broken marriage instead of a chaotic one. I would make that trade again, every single time, without hesitation, no matter how much it cost me privately to hold that line for 5 long months while performing an ordinary domestic life every single evening in front of 2 children who had no idea their entire world was already quietly being rebuilt underneath them. I want to end this by taking you back to exactly 1 year after that Wednesday night in the kitchen, because I think it's the right place to close this story, standing at almost the exact same point on the calendar, looking at how completely different everything actually was. It was a Wednesday again, as it happened, purely by coincidence of how the year had unfolded, and I found myself that evening sitting on the back porch of the house I'd bought after Kestrel Lane sold, watching Nathan and Sophie in the yard with Ellen's son, the 3 of them arguing cheerfully over the rules of some game they were half inventing as they went, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that actually stopped me for a moment, that exactly 1 year earlier, almost to the hour, I'd been standing in a different kitchen listening to my then-wife tell me she wanted a divorce, already knowing everything she didn't yet know I knew, already carrying 5 months of careful, lonely preparation that was about to become suddenly, irreversibly real. 1 year, 12 months. 52 weeks between a woman standing in a kitchen with her car keys in her hand, rehearsing a sentence she thought would catch me completely off guard, and a man sitting on a porch watching his children laugh in a yard that belonged entirely to a life he had built, carefully, deliberately, on his own terms, out of the wreckage of the life he'd thought he was going to have forever. I called Patricia that same evening, more out of habit than necessity by that point, just to tell her the divorce had now been final for exactly the length of time it had taken to go through the whole process in the first place. 6 months of preparation before the filing, 6 months of legal process after it. A full year on either side of that Tuesday morning she'd walked the petition into the county clerk's office. She laughed, in the dry way I'd come to genuinely appreciate over that whole year, and said, "Mr. Dawson, most of my clients call me when things are falling apart. You're one of the only ones who still calls a year later just to tell me things are good." I told her that felt like the least I could do, given everything, and she said, "No, actually, I think it's the whole point. I don't do this job to help people get divorced. I do it to help people get to the other side of a divorce as intact as possible, and you did that better than almost anyone I've worked with in over 2 decades of this. That's not a small thing, Mr. Dawson. Most people don't manage it. I think about the version of myself standing in that kitchen exactly a year before Ellen's son, and my own children argued cheerfully over made-up rules in a backyard I owned, free of any ghost of the life before it, and I think the thing I'd most want that version of myself to know, if I could somehow send a message backward across that exact year, is not that everything works out, because I don't think that's always true, and I don't want to promise anyone listening to this some guarantee the universe doesn't actually offer. What I'd want him to know instead is narrower and more useful than that. I'd want him to know that the patience is going to feel unbearable, some nights specifically, sitting across from a woman he still loves in some complicated way, while a folder in a rented storage unit across town holds the truth she doesn't know he already has. I'd want him to know that staying level in that kitchen when she finally says the word divorce, staying level when she tries to reframe the marriage's problems into a joint failure, staying level when she tries to use his own careful preparation as evidence of some cold, controlling nature, all of that is going to cost him more discipline than almost anything else he's ever done in his life, and that it is worth every single ounce of that discipline, because the version of this story where he loses control of the timeline, even for one single conversation, is a version where she gets to decide how the rest of his family's life unfolds, instead of him. I think, too, about the specific version of strength this whole experience taught me to actually respect, as opposed to the version I might have believed in before any of it happened. Before that year, if you had asked me what strength looked like in a moment like this, I probably would have described something closer to what movies show you. A furious confrontation, a dramatic ultimatum, some cathartic explosion of righteous anger that makes for a satisfying scene. I don't believe that anymore. I believe strength looks like sitting at a kitchen table with your spouse, knowing exactly what she's hiding, and asking her gently about her day instead. I believe it looks like driving home from a private investigator's office with photographs of your wife's affair in a folder on the passenger seat, and then walking into your house and helping your daughter with a spelling test without your voice shaking. I believe it looks like waiting, and waiting, and waiting some more, past the point where waiting feels like anything except its own quiet form of suffering, because you have decided with total clarity that the people depending on you deserve a version of this crisis that was handled carefully, rather than a version that simply happened to both of you all at once, in chaos, with nobody steering. If you are sitting somewhere right now with your own version of a hotel receipt that doesn't quite add up, your own version of a phone that gets flipped face down a little too quickly, your own quiet, unwelcome suspicion that something in your marriage has shifted into a shape you don't recognize anymore, I am not going to tell you what to do, because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a therapist. I'm just a man who lived through one specific version of this and came out the other side with his children intact and his own sense of himself intact alongside them. But I will tell you this much, because it's the one thing I know for certain. Sitting here a full 3 years past that kitchen now, married again, settled again, at genuine peace in a way I did not think was possible during the worst of those 5 months. Whatever you're facing, know the truth before you act on it. Get the facts before you get the confrontation. Protect yourself and the people who depend on you before you protect your own need for an immediate answer. The truth is going to arrive eventually either way, on its own schedule, whether you go looking for it or wait for it to find you. The only real choice you actually have is whether you're the one holding it when it does, or whether you let someone else decide that for you instead. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, if any part of it reminded you of your own life, your own marriage, your own quiet, private season of finding out something you never wanted to know, I'd ask you to subscribe to this channel. because we tell true stories like this one every single week. Stories about the moment ordinary people discover the person they trusted most was living a different life right alongside the one they built together, and what those people chose to do once they knew. Leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done in my position, whether you think 5 months of silence was patience or something closer to a kind of coldness. Because I've heard both opinions from people who've heard this story before, and I genuinely want to know where you land on it. And if you're going through something like this right now, something you haven't told anyone yet, I hope some small part of what I've shared today gives you the same thing Ray Coleman gave me in that little office with the burnt coffee smell, the simple, steadying reminder that certainty, however long it takes to get there, is always worth more than suspicion, and that whatever you eventually decide to do with the truth once you have it, you deserve to be the one holding it first. I'll leave you with the same thought I keep coming back to myself sitting here years later, settled, steady, genuinely at peace in a life I built carefully out of the wreckage of one I thought would last forever. She stood in that kitchen with her keys in her hand, certain she was about to control exactly how and when I found out my whole life was about to change. She never once considered that I might already be 3 steps ahead of her, quietly, patiently, protecting the only 2 people in that story who never asked to be part of any of it in the first place. If you take one thing from everything I've told you today, let it be that. Know the truth before you act on it. Protect what matters before you protect your pride. And when the moment finally comes to speak, make sure you're the one who gets to decide exactly how the story actually ends. Thank you again for spending this time with me and with Nathan and Sophie's story, even in the small, quiet way of simply listening all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.